Imagine yourself standing on a railway platform where a runaway trolley barrels toward 5 workers trapped on the tracks ahead, certain death awaiting them in mere seconds. And beside you stands a lever that could divert the trolley onto a side track where it would inevitably kill one lone worker instead. A person who had no knowledge of the danger and who would live through this day unharmed if you simply did nothing at all. This is the classical trolley problem, a thought experiment that has haunted philosophers, ethicists, and ordinary people for decades, because it forces us to confront a fundamental conflict between two opposing moral frameworks that seem equally valid yet mutually exclusive. On one hand, there exists the utilitarian calculus that suggests 5 deaths represent a greater harm than 1 death, and therefore any rational person who possesses the power to reduce suffering should pull the lever, should make the active choice that results in fewer total casualties, regardless of their personal agency, in bringing about that single death. On the other hand, there exists the deontological perspective that insists there is a categorical moral difference between allowing harm to occur and actively causing harm through your own deliberate actions, and that you cannot justify murdering an innocent person even if doing so would save others, because such an act violates fundamental principles about treating people as ends rather than means. The persistence of this dilemma throughout modern ethical discourse reveals something profound about human moral intuition. We have internalized contradictory values so completely that we can hold both perspectives simultaneously without experiencing any cognitive resolution, suggesting that our moral systems are not derived from pure logic, but rather emerge from evolved emotional responses, cultural conditioning, and competing philosophical traditions that have shaped how we interpret responsibility and intention. Imagine a parent standing in a pharmacy, watching their child suffer from a treatable illness that could be cured with medication they cannot afford, a situation that unfolds across countless communities where the intersection of poverty and healthcare access creates an impossible moral crossroads that tests the very foundations of how we understand right and wrong. The child needs insulin or antibiotics or an essential treatment that exists mere feet away behind glass or in digital inventory systems. Yet the cost exceeds what the family can manage after paying rent and utilities and keeping food on the table, forcing a caregiver to contemplate an action they never imagined taking before this moment arrived. The psychological mechanism underlying this dilemma operates through a fundamental human hierarchy of values where the preservation of a child's health and life transcends the abstract concept of property ownership and legal compliance, a prioritization so deeply embedded in our nature that most people instinctively recognize it as justified even while simultaneously acknowledging the existence of laws against theft. We have constructed elaborate systems of commerce and intellectual property protection and pharmaceutical pricing that operate according to rational economic principles. Yet these systems were built without adequate consideration for scenarios where basic human survival becomes contingent on access to treatments protected by market forces rather than distributed according to medical necessity. The persistence of this dilemma reveals a profound contradiction in how modern societies function, where we simultaneously claim to value both the sanctity of life and the inviolability of property rights, creating situations where these values inevitably collide and force individuals to choose between their conscience and their compliance with systems that, when examined honestly, seem to have abandoned them first. Consider the moment when your partner asks if they look good in an outfit they are genuinely excited about, and you can see that the fit is unflattering, the color drains their complexion, and the style does not suit them in any meaningful way. Yet you smile and say that they look wonderful, that the outfit is perfect for them, that they should absolutely wear it with confidence. This lie emerges not from malice or deception for personal gain, but from a collision between two competing values that most people hold simultaneously: the desire to be honest and truthful with those we love, and the desire to protect them from unnecessary pain. The psychological mechanism at work here is what we might call compassionate deception, where the liar has made a calculation that the truth will cause more harm than good, that the recipient does not actually need this information to make their life better, and that the temporary boost to their self-esteem or emotional state is worth the violation of honesty. We extend this logic across countless scenarios, telling an aging parent that their memory is fine when it is clearly declining, assuring a friend that their creative work is brilliant when we found it derivative, pretending to enjoy a meal that someone labored to cook despite it being genuinely unappetizing, or telling a colleague that their presentation was engaging when it was actually painfully boring. What makes this particular moral dilemma so persistent despite its logical inconsistencies is that we have collectively normalized the idea that love sometimes requires protective dishonesty, that there exists a category of truths that are technically accurate but practically cruel, and that the relationship itself becomes more important than the transparency within it. We rarely acknowledge how this erodes the very trust we claim to be protecting, or how it denies people the information they might need to grow, improve, or make better choices for themselves. Imagine you are walking along a platform at a train station when you notice a child you have never met before wandering onto the tracks as an approaching train rounds the corner. And in that singular moment of crystallized choice, you have perhaps 5 seconds to decide whether you will leap down to push that child to safety, knowing with near certainty that you yourself will be struck and killed in the process, leaving behind your own family, your own plans, your own unlived future in exchange for saving the life of someone whose name you do not know, and whose existence has no bearing whatsoever on your own survival or the survival of those you love most. This scenario exposes a profound tension at the heart of human morality, because logically speaking, from a purely evolutionary and selfish standpoint, there exists no rational reason to sacrifice your continued existence for the existence of a complete stranger whose genetic material shares nothing with you and whose death would provide you with no tangible benefit or protection. And yet, across cultures and throughout history, we have stories and documentation of ordinary people making precisely this choice, stepping into harm's way for individuals they have never met and will never know, suggesting that embedded within human consciousness is some ancient, almost primitive sense of obligation to other members of our species that supersedes the basic instinct for self-preservation. The psychological mechanism at work appears to involve a kind of imaginative empathy that floods our awareness in moments of acute crisis, where we briefly inhabit the interior experience of another person and feel their vulnerability as though it were our own, creating a temporary dissolution of the boundary between self and other that makes their death feel as catastrophic as our own death would feel, even though rationally we know this feeling is a kind of beautiful lie. Imagine yourself stranded in the frozen wilderness after a plane crash, or trapped in a cave system with no prospect of rescue, your food supplies depleted weeks ago, your body growing weaker with each passing day until the very act of breathing becomes a conscious effort requiring the last reserves of your will. In such an extreme scenario, you are faced with an impossible choice. Allow yourself and perhaps others to die of starvation, or consume the flesh of those who have already perished around you. This is not a hypothetical confined to fiction or philosophy classrooms. History provides us with documented cases of survival cannibalism, from the tragic accounts of the Donner Party crossing the Sierra Nevada in 1846, to the Uruguayan rugby team stranded in the Andes in 1972, to the sailors of the Essex who drifted in lifeboats after their whaling ship was rammed by a sperm whale. In each instance, ordinary people facing imminent death made the calculated decision to consume human remains as a means of survival. The psychological mechanism that permits such an act involves a fundamental reordering of moral priorities when confronted with absolute necessity. The human mind, when faced with certain death, engages in what might be called an ethical calculus, in which the violation of the deepest cultural taboo becomes rationally justified as the lesser of two evils. Survival instinct overrides the disgust response and cultural conditioning that would normally make such an act unthinkable. Yet what remains philosophically curious is how thoroughly we have managed to suppress any serious moral engagement with this reality in our comfortable modern existence. We acknowledge these historical cases with a kind of detached fascination, treating them as cautionary tales or remarkable footnotes rather than recognizing them as genuine dilemmas that expose the fragility of our moral frameworks. Imagine a scenario where security forces have detained someone they believe possesses critical intelligence about an imminent threat to civilian lives, perhaps information about a planned attack that could kill thousands of innocent people if left undiscovered. The interrogators face an urgent choice: employ conventional questioning methods that may take time they do not have, or resort to physical coercion and torture to extract information quickly. This is the utilitarian calculus that has haunted military and intelligence operations for centuries, a tension between the moral prohibition against torturing human beings and the consequentialist argument that causing pain to one person might prevent greater suffering for many others. The psychological mechanism that allows this dilemma to persist operates through a series of logical justifications that feel compelling in moments of genuine fear and urgency. When decision-makers genuinely believe they face a ticking time bomb scenario, the abstract principle against torture becomes difficult to maintain because principles seem like luxuries we cannot afford when lives hang in the balance. The interrogator can convince themselves that they are acting as a necessary evil, that they bear the moral weight of their actions, but that the weight is justified by the potential outcome. Furthermore, the human mind excels at rationalizing harm when we convince ourselves it serves a greater good, and when the victim is already dehumanized as a suspected terrorist or enemy combatant, the psychological barriers to inflicting pain weaken considerably. Yet what persists despite all rational examination is how rarely the premise of the dilemma actually reflects reality. Torture rarely produces reliable intelligence because people under extreme duress will say anything to make the pain stop, introducing false information into the decision-making process. The ticking time bomb scenario almost never materializes in actual practice. Imagine you have known someone since childhood, a person who has been present through your most vulnerable moments, who has celebrated your victories and comforted you in your darkest hours, and you discover that this person has committed a serious crime that has caused genuine harm to an innocent victim. Perhaps they have stolen a significant sum of money from their employer, or they have assaulted someone, or they have engaged in systematic fraud that has ruined families financially. And now you face the decision of whether to report them to authorities, knowing with absolute certainty that doing so will destroy the friendship, will result in their legal prosecution, will cause them immense suffering, and will fundamentally alter the trajectory of their life. The psychological mechanism underlying this dilemma operates at the intersection of two powerful human drives: loyalty, which is deeply encoded in our social bonding instincts and which represents our commitment to those within our inner circle, and justice, which appeals to our sense of fairness, our belief in moral order, and our responsibility to protect those who have been wronged by someone's actions. When we prioritize friendship over justice, we are essentially saying that our personal relationships matter more than the harm done to strangers, that our comfort and emotional security is worth the suffering of unknown victims. Yet this creates a troubling moral inversion where the innocent party who was harmed becomes secondary to our desire to preserve a bond that, however meaningful, is now built upon complicity. Imagine a scenario where a medical catastrophe forces you into an impossible position. Two of your children require the same rare organ transplant, but only one donor match exists, and there is absolutely no way to save them both. You have perhaps hours to decide which child receives the transplant and which one will not survive. The decision falls entirely to you, the parent, because the medical team cannot make this choice and the law does not permit it. You must live with the knowledge that your decision directly caused the death of one of your biological children while allowing the other to live. This is not a hypothetical that emerges from medical negligence or systemic failure, but rather a genuine scenario that has occurred in real hospital settings around the world, forcing parents into a role that no parent should ever inhabit. The psychological mechanism underlying this dilemma operates on several levels simultaneously. First, there is the mathematical absurdity of it. You are being asked to assign unequal value to beings you created and love equally, which violates something fundamental in how we understand parental love and equality. Second, there is the permanence factor, the fact that this decision cannot be undone, revised, or compromised. Third, and perhaps most deeply, this dilemma exposes the fiction that parental love is infinite and unconditional in a way that can manifest itself practically, because when forced to choose, you cannot love both children equally in action, only in principle. The guilt that accompanies either choice becomes a form of psychological scarring that persists throughout your remaining lifetime. What makes this dilemma so persistently devastating is that we have not truly normalized it despite its occasional occurrence, yet we also have not developed any cultural, medical, or legal framework that makes it easier to bear. We simply accept that such moments exist, that some parents must face them, and that there is no morally correct answer, only the answer you choose and must live alongside forever. Imagine watching someone you love more than life itself deteriorate slowly over months or years, their body ravaged by terminal illness, their mind still present enough to understand what is happening, their pain medication no longer effective despite escalating doses, their dignity stripped away by the body's betrayal. their explicit wishes to end their suffering going unheeded by medical systems bound by law and professional codes that prioritize prolonging existence over honoring autonomy. You sit beside them as they beg you to help them die, their eyes pleading with you to take action, to end their misery, and you face an impossible choice between respecting their autonomous wish and breaking laws designed to protect life, between showing compassion through action and showing compassion through presence. The psychological mechanism underlying this dilemma reveals something profound about how we value different principles when they conflict irreconcilably with one another, because we are forced to choose between sanctity of life, personal autonomy, prevention of suffering, and legal compliance, principles that seem equally valid until they cannot all be honored simultaneously. We construct our moral frameworks around assumptions that these values can coexist peacefully, yet terminal suffering exposes the fiction of that harmony, forcing us to rank principles hierarchically in ways that feel fundamentally wrong no matter which we prioritize. What persists despite this apparent logical impasse is our cultural ambivalence toward the question itself, where we speak of compassionate care while legally prohibiting the most compassionate choice some individuals might make, where we accept the prolongation of unbearable suffering in the name of protecting life, yet somehow convince ourselves this represents respect for human dignity rather than its violation. Where societies remain frozen in philosophical disagreement while individuals suffer in the margins of that disagreement, their requests unheard, their autonomy overridden, their pain deemed less important than the legal protection of a principle they themselves have rejected. Imagine discovering that one of your parents, the person who raised you and provided for your survival, has committed a serious crime. Perhaps you find evidence of theft, fraud, violence, or some form of abuse directed at someone outside your family. You now possess knowledge that could lead to their arrest, prosecution, and imprisonment. The dilemma emerges at the intersection of two profound moral obligations: your duty to the victim and society's legal system, and your loyalty to the family bond that shaped your entire identity and existence. If you report them, you set in motion events that will destroy your family as you know it, remove a parent from your home, create financial hardship for dependents, and position yourself as the betrayer in your family narrative. If you stay silent, you become complicit in their wrongdoing, you deny justice to their victim, and you allow someone capable of serious harm to potentially repeat those actions. The psychological mechanism underlying this dilemma runs deeper than simple loyalty versus justice. It touches something primal in human development. The parent-child relationship is typically the first relationship of absolute dependency and trust. Our parents are our introduction to morality itself, yet they are also fallible humans capable of corruption. Reporting a parent feels like a violation of a sacred compact, a breaking of the implicit agreement that family protects its own. Simultaneously, remaining silent means prioritizing family preservation over the fundamental principle that all people deserve equal protection under the law. What makes this dilemma persist despite its apparent logical simplicity is that we rarely view family obligations and civic obligations as equally binding. We tend to believe that blood relations deserve special consideration that strangers do not, yet modern legal systems are built on the premise that justice should be blind to such distinctions. Imagine a scenario where a medical student, having studied diligently for months, finds themselves in a position where cheating on a crucial licensing examination could enable them to graduate and secure a position at a rural hospital desperately understaffed and unable to provide adequate care to a remote community facing a genuine health crisis. The student knows with reasonable certainty that by obtaining the answers through illicit means, they would pass an exam they might otherwise fail by a narrow margin, allowing them to fill a critical gap in healthcare provision for a population that would otherwise suffer preventable deaths due to lack of medical attention. The moral framework here becomes complicated because the traditional understanding of academic integrity, built upon centuries of institutional trust and individual merit, suddenly collides with the immediate, tangible suffering of real people whose survival depends on the presence of a qualified physician. In this instance, the act of cheating functions not as a shortcut for personal advancement, but as an instrument of harm reduction, a utilitarian calculation where breaking one rule potentially saves multiple lives and prevents genuine suffering on a scale that feels impossible to ignore. The psychological mechanism underlying this dilemma rests upon our capacity to recognize that moral rules, while generally essential for social functioning, exist within a hierarchy of importance that can shift dramatically when fundamental human welfare enters into the equation. We understand intuitively that the prohibition against cheating serves important purposes, maintaining standards, ensuring fairness, protecting public safety. Yet we also recognize that rules themselves are ultimately justified by their consequences and their service to human flourishing. When following a rule produces catastrophic outcomes for innocent people, our moral intuitions begin to strain against the absolute prohibition, creating genuine cognitive and ethical tension. Consider the situation where you have made a solemn promise to a friend, a family member, or a colleague, and that promise carries significant weight and meaning in your relationship with them. Now imagine that you discover, through circumstances beyond your initial knowledge, that keeping this promise would directly result in serious harm coming to an innocent person, whether that harm manifests as physical danger, psychological trauma, financial ruin, or some other form of profound suffering. The dilemma crystallizes in this moment of recognition. The moral obligation you created through your word suddenly conflicts with the fundamental ethical principle that preventing harm should take precedence over almost all other considerations. What makes this dilemma particularly acute is that breaking your promise feels like a betrayal, a violation of trust and your own integrity, yet honoring it makes you complicit in preventable suffering. The psychological mechanism underlying this conflict operates on multiple levels simultaneously. Promises function as social contracts that bind us to our word, and we internalize from early childhood that breaking promises erodes trust, damages relationships, and marks us as unreliable or untrustworthy people. This creates a powerful emotional resistance to breaking any promise, regardless of circumstances. Simultaneously, our moral intuitions about harm prevention are equally strong, perhaps even stronger at a basic human level, because preventing suffering feels like the most fundamental ethical obligation we possess. The brain essentially recognizes two competing moral frameworks as equally valid, and neither yields easily to the other. What is remarkable is how rarely we encounter this dilemma in its pure form, and yet how often it emerges in subtle variations throughout human life. We have normalized a kind of moral compartmentalization where we act as though promises always matter and harm prevention always matters, trusting that the world will rarely force us to choose between them directly. Imagine a future where parents can select the genetic traits of their children before birth, choosing everything from eye color and height to intelligence and disease resistance, creating what we might call designer babies tailored to meet parental expectations and societal preferences. This technology, while still largely theoretical in its most ambitious forms, represents a profound shift in how we think about human reproduction and the very nature of what it means to be born. As genetic engineering techniques like CRISPR and other advanced biotechnologies move closer to practical application in human germline editing. The scenario forces us to confront a series of interconnected moral questions. If we have the capability to eliminate genetic diseases and suffering, do we have an obligation to use it, and at what point does medical intervention become enhancement, transformation, or even a form of parental control that reduces human beings to consumer products designed to specification? The psychological mechanism at work here involves our natural desire to give our children every advantage in a competitive world, combined with our discomfort with the randomness and unpredictability of natural reproduction, creating a compelling narrative that positions genetic selection as simply an extension of other parental choices like education and nutrition. We tell ourselves that if we can prevent suffering, we should, yet this logic quietly shifts toward a world where genetic diversity becomes a luxury only the wealthy can afford, where certain traits become mandatory rather than optional, where children born without genetic optimization face discrimination, and where the pressure to design perfect offspring becomes another form of societal coercion that no parent can truly escape. Imagine a city on the edge of civil unrest, where tensions between communities have reached a breaking point, and intelligence suggests that a violent riot is imminent within the next 48 hours. The authorities face a genuine dilemma. They know that if they do nothing, hundreds of people could be injured, property could be destroyed, and the social fabric could tear irreparably. However, they also know that one particular individual, who is entirely innocent of any wrongdoing and has committed no crime, has become a symbol or flashpoint in the community consciousness. This person might be a public figure whose mere presence inflames passions, or perhaps they have been falsely accused by rumors, or they represent something that one faction despises. The calculation becomes brutally simple in the minds of those in power. If we arrest or detain this innocent person, the symbolic victory will satisfy the angry masses enough to prevent the riot from occurring. The cost is the violation of one innocent person's rights and freedom, set against the prevention of widespread violence and suffering affecting thousands. The psychological mechanism at work here involves what we might call the mathematics of moral compromise, where decision-makers convince themselves that sacrificing one innocent life or one person's liberty represents an acceptable trade-off for preventing greater chaos. This logic has a seductive quality because it appears pragmatic and consequentialist, grounded in real numbers and real suffering. Yet what makes this dilemma so morally corrosive is that it fundamentally inverts the purpose of justice systems, which exist precisely to protect the innocent from state power, not to weaponize innocence against itself. What persists most disturbingly is how frequently this rationalization appears in real governance, from detaining innocent people during security crises to scapegoating marginalized groups to prevent unrest, suggesting that we have collectively internalized a dangerous exception to our stated moral principles whenever sufficient chaos looms on the horizon. Imagine you are walking along a beach or a lakeside path on an ordinary afternoon, perhaps lost in thought or preoccupied with the concerns of your own day, when you notice someone in the water calling for help, their voice growing increasingly desperate as they struggle against the current. The situation is unambiguous. A human being is drowning, their life hanging in the balance, and you are physically present and capable of intervention, yet you continue walking as though nothing is happening, perhaps quickening your pace to distance yourself from the sounds of their distress. This scenario, initially shocking when stated so plainly, reveals something profound about how we compartmentalize our moral responsibilities based on proximity and relationship. The drowning stranger presents no personal connection to you, no shared history or mutual obligation in the conventional sense, and this absence of relationship creates a psychological distance that allows us to treat their suffering as somehow separate from our sphere of moral concern. We might rationalize our inaction through various justifications. Perhaps we convince ourselves that someone else will help, that we lack the swimming ability to assist effectively, that our own safety might be compromised, or even that intervening might make the situation worse rather than better. These rationalizations, whether logically sound or merely comforting fictions, allow us to preserve our self-image as good people while simultaneously allowing another person to perish. The persistence of this dilemma in our moral consciousness stems from the fact that most of us would intellectually acknowledge an obligation to save a drowning stranger if we truly could, yet we rarely examine the conditions under which we actually honor that obligation or the subtle ways we find to avoid it. Consider the reality that exists in many parts of the world where individuals, often living in conditions of profound financial desperation, make the decision to sell one of their organs, most commonly a kidney or a portion of their liver, to wealthy recipients who desperately need transplants and can afford to pay significant sums of money for access to these biological resources. This practice creates a direct market transaction around something that was once considered fundamentally inalienable from human dignity, transforming a part of one's body into a commodity that can be bought and sold like any other good in an economic system. The psychological mechanism at work here involves a calculation of desperation against physical risk, where individuals facing impossible choices between financial survival and bodily integrity must weigh the immediate and severe consequences of poverty against the potential health complications that might arise from organ removal, complications that may not manifest for years or decades. Existing in an uncertain future that feels less real than the pressing hunger or debt of the present moment. The logical structure supporting this practice rests on principles of individual autonomy and property rights, suggesting that if a person owns their body, they should possess the absolute right to do with it as they wish, including selling parts of it. Yet this reasoning often ignores the coercive nature of desperation and the way extreme poverty eliminates genuine choice by making refusal appear impossible. What remains remarkable is how this practice persists, and in some cases becomes increasingly normalized in our contemporary world, not because we have concluded that commodifying human organs represents the ethical pinnacle of human civilization, but rather because we have accepted it as an inevitable consequence of allowing market forces to penetrate every domain of human existence, including the most intimate territories of embodied life. And we tell ourselves that this represents freedom, even as we witness vulnerable populations surrendering irreplaceable parts of themselves simply to survive. Consider the parent who discovers that their child has committed a heinous crime against another family, an act so severe that it has fractured a community and destroyed innocent lives. Yet that parent finds themselves unable to fully withdraw their love or support from their own child, caught between the moral imperative to condemn the act and the biological, emotional pull toward the person who shares their blood. Or imagine the survivor of profound trauma, perhaps someone who endured years of systematic abuse, who encounters their perpetrator years later and experiences an unexpected wave of compassion, even forgiveness, not because the harm was justified or forgotten, but because holding on to rage has calcified into a weight too heavy to carry alone. These scenarios represent a profound psychological paradox. Humans possess the capacity to extend forgiveness even when logic suggests that forgiveness is a betrayal of justice itself, a surrender that enables future harm and dishonors the gravity of past suffering. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon is deeply rooted in our neurological architecture and social bonding systems, as the same neural pathways that generate empathy and attachment are involuntary. We do not consciously decide to feel connection to those we love, nor can we entirely command ourselves to feel nothing but hatred toward those who have wronged us. And this involuntary nature of emotion often conflicts with our moral reasoning about what justice demands. We have normalized this contradiction in countless cultural narratives, from religious traditions that emphasize redemption and second chances to psychological frameworks that treat forgiveness as essential to healing. Yet we simultaneously maintain systems of punishment predicated on the assumption that the wrongdoer deserves suffering in proportion to their crime, creating a lasting tension between our capacity for mercy and our sense of proportional accountability that persists unresolved because forgiveness operates on an emotional and spiritual register that exists somewhat apart from the logical mechanisms of justice. Imagine you work in a position of moderate authority within a company, perhaps in management or operations, and you discover that your employer is engaging in a practice that is technically legal but fundamentally unethical. Perhaps they are knowingly selling a product with a minor safety flaw, or they are systematically underpaying workers in developing countries, or they are deliberately misleading customers about the environmental impact of their services. You have a family depending on your income, a mortgage to pay, children's education to fund, and the knowledge that if you speak up you will almost certainly be terminated, your career will be damaged, and your financial security will evaporate. The dilemma crystallizes into its simplest form. Do you prioritize your family's well-being by remaining silent and complicit, or do you sacrifice your livelihood for a principle that, in the grand scheme of things, might not actually change the outcome anyway? The psychological mechanism at work here operates through a process called moral rationalization, wherein the mind constructs elaborate justifications for compromising ethical standards by emphasizing the immediate, tangible consequences of moral action against the abstract, distant consequences of moral inaction. Your brain tells you that one person cannot make a difference, that the harm will occur regardless of your participation, and that your family's suffering is more real and more urgent than the suffering of people you will never meet. This creates a false equivalence between personal survival and complicity, making the choice feel less like a moral failure and more like a reasonable adaptation to an impossible situation. Consider the position of an employee who discovers that their employer, a company where they have worked for 15 years, is systematically defrauding customers or knowingly distributing a dangerous product that causes harm to vulnerable populations. This person has a family who depends on their income, a mortgage they are paying, children in school, and a spouse whose own career has been built around the stability this job provides. To report these illegal activities to regulatory authorities or the media would likely result in immediate termination, years of legal battles, social ostracization within their professional community, and the potential collapse of their family's financial security and stability. Yet remaining silent makes them complicit in ongoing harm to strangers, a moral compromise that erodes their sense of self and integrity with each passing day. The dilemma intensifies because there exists no guarantee that whistleblowing will actually stop the harmful behavior, and the personal cost to the whistleblower's family is absolutely certain and immediate, while the benefit to society remains theoretical and distant. The psychological mechanism at work here involves a collision between two deeply internalized values: the duty to protect one's own family, which evolution has made visceral and urgent, and the broader moral obligation to prevent harm to unknown others, which requires abstract reasoning and delayed gratification. We have constructed a system where these obligations are placed in direct conflict, where doing the right thing according to law and ethics demands sacrificing the people you love most, and where your loyalty as a family member is positioned as irreconcilable with your loyalty to the public good. This remains normalized in our society despite being fundamentally unreasonable, despite the fact that we claim to admire whistleblowers even as we have failed to create structural protections that would make whistleblowing something other than an act of family self-sabotage, something other than choosing between your conscience and your children's well-being. Consider the scenario where a pharmaceutical company develops a promising treatment for a devastating human disease, one that causes immense suffering and claims thousands of lives each year. Yet the regulatory framework demands that before this treatment can be administered to a single human patient, it must first be tested on thousands of animals, most commonly mice, rabbits, dogs, and primates, knowing with reasonable certainty that the vast majority of these creatures will experience pain, illness, organ damage, or death in the process. The tension emerges from our simultaneous conviction that human life possesses extraordinary moral value worthy of protection, and our growing recognition that animal consciousness and capacity for suffering are far more sophisticated than we once believed, yet we have constructed an entire system that treats the suffering of animals as a necessary and acceptable cost of human medical advancement. The psychological mechanism underlying this dilemma operates through a process of abstraction and moral compartmentalization, wherein we acknowledge that animals feel pain and fear, yet we classify this suffering as instrumental rather than intrinsically wrong, a means to a justifiable end rather than a moral violation in itself. We have normalized this practice across generations, incorporating it so thoroughly into our understanding of how medicine must work that questioning it feels almost naive, as though we are ignoring obvious scientific necessity, when in reality we are perpetuating a system born from historical assumptions about animal consciousness that neuroscience has increasingly undermined. The paradox deepens when we consider that our moral framework permits us to cause guaranteed suffering to millions of creatures based on the probability of preventing future human suffering, a calculation that somehow feels more rational when the suffering is hidden behind laboratory walls and the beneficiaries are abstract future patients rather than present ones. Imagine a society where the formal mechanisms of justice have become so thoroughly compromised that citizens begin taking enforcement into their own hands, pursuing those they believe guilty of crimes that the official system has failed to address. A parent discovers their child's abuser has been released on a technicality and decides to track them down themselves. A neighborhood watch group identifies what they believe to be a drug dealer operating with police protection and takes matters into their own hands. Victim of a major crime finds the perpetrator working freely while evidence mysteriously disappears from official investigations. These individuals face an impossible choice: accept that genuine wrongdoing will go unpunished, or become instruments of punishment themselves, operating outside legal frameworks they no longer trust. The psychological mechanism at work here is profound, rooted in the human need for justice and the restoration of moral order when institutional structures fail. When people observe that the system designed to protect them actively protects the powerful and corrupt while abandoning the vulnerable, something breaks inside the collective moral consciousness. They begin to rationalize extrajudicial action not as lawlessness, but as necessary correction of a system that has already abandoned its own principles. This creates a recursive cycle where vigilantism appears not as criminal behavior, but as moral necessity. Yet societies continue to permit and even normalize this dynamic, allowing corruption to persist within justice systems while simultaneously condemning those who act against it. We maintain formal allegiance to rule of law while tolerating its systematic failure, creating a space where ordinary people must choose between being passive witnesses to injustice or becoming vigilantes themselves, a paradox that defines modern approaches to accountability. Imagine a scenario where a government has become demonstrably oppressive, where laws have been weaponized against innocent populations, where the legal system itself has become an instrument of persecution rather than justice. In this context, a person commits an act that would ordinarily be considered criminal, perhaps theft, violence, or sabotage, but their motivation emerges from resistance to systematic injustice. Now you discover this person and you face a choice. Do you turn them into authorities, or do you conceal their identity and help them escape? The dilemma cuts to the heart of moral obligation because it forces you to choose between two competing principles that we typically hold sacred: the rule of law and the protection of human rights. When you hide this person, you are breaking the law, betraying the institutional structures that society depends upon, and actively obstructing justice. Yet when you turn them in, you become complicit in an oppressive system, a cog in machinery designed to crush dissent and eliminate those who challenge tyranny. The psychological mechanism underlying this dilemma is the fundamental conflict between order and justice, between stability and morality. We are taught to respect authority and obey laws because these structures theoretically protect us, yet history demonstrates repeatedly that laws themselves become weapons in the hands of tyrants, that obedience to unjust systems makes us accomplices to atrocity. The dilemma persists because we live in the tension between these truths. We need rules to function as societies, yet we also know that rules can become instruments of cruelty. We have normalized the assumption that legal authority always carries moral weight, rarely questioning what happens when that assumption collapses entirely, when the law becomes indistinguishable from injustice itself. Imagine a society where the state claims ownership over your body the moment you die, automatically harvesting your organs for transplantation unless you explicitly opt out during your lifetime. A system already implemented in several countries including France, Spain, and Austria. In this framework, the presumption shifts entirely. Instead of asking whether you consent to donation, the system assumes you do consent unless you have actively registered your refusal, fundamentally inverting the relationship between individual autonomy and state authority over the human body. The mechanism driving this approach rests on a seductive utilitarian calculus, the notion that thousands of lives could be saved each year if we simply change the default setting from opt-in to opt-out, trading individual choice for collective benefit, and arguing that since the organs would otherwise be wasted, the moral cost of this inversion becomes negligible or even justified. Yet beneath this logical framework lies something psychologically more complex: the normalization of state ownership over the deceased, the gradual erosion of the principle that your body belongs to you and potentially your family, and the acceptance that the government can repurpose your physical form for social good without explicit permission, a precedent that historically has never remained limited to such benign applications. What persists despite the logical tension is a peculiar moral blindness wherein we celebrate the life-saving outcomes while avoiding deeper examination of what it means to live in a society that has decided your body is communal property by default, where opting out of this arrangement requires bureaucratic vigilance, and where the state's interest in your organs outweighs your family's wishes or your own unstated preferences, creating a world where bodily autonomy, that foundational principle of modern ethics, becomes something you must actively defend rather than something automatically granted to you. Imagine that your child has died in an accident and modern science has advanced to the point where cloning technology is accessible, affordable, and legal. You possess biological material, perhaps a strand of hair, a sample of skin cells, or preserved genetic material, and you face the profound question of whether to use it to create a genetic duplicate of your deceased child. The clone would share identical DNA with your lost child, would grow and develop through childhood again, and would eventually become a person who looks exactly as your child might have looked at each stage of life. Yet this clone would be born into a world where their predecessor already lived and died, would carry the weight of being a replacement, and would possess no memories of the life that came before them. The psychological mechanism underlying this temptation is rooted in our deepest human fear of permanent loss and our desperate desire to reverse death itself. Grief has no statute of limitations, and the promise of cloning technology offers something that has never existed before in human history: a biological second chance, a way to recover what was taken. Parents might rationalize that they would not burden the clone with the identity of the deceased child, that they would raise this new person as their own unique individual, yet the psychological reality would be far more complicated. The clone would inevitably be compared to the original, measured against memories both real and idealized, and forced to live in the shadow of someone they would never truly know. Society has not yet fully normalized human cloning for reproductive purposes, and many jurisdictions prohibit it entirely, yet we continue to develop the technology regardless, and the emotional logic that drives parents toward this choice persists in our collective consciousness as something we understand even when we cannot endorse it. Consider the scenario in which a medical professional or family member makes the decision to end another person's life without explicit permission, often justified through paternalistic reasoning that they know what is best for the suffering individual, or that the person is incapable of consenting due to severe cognitive impairment, unconsciousness, or advanced dementia. This dilemma forces us to confront the fundamental tension between respecting autonomous choice and preventing unnecessary suffering, between the principle that no one should die without their consent and the compassionate impulse to relieve unbearable pain when a person cannot articulate their wishes. The psychological mechanism underlying this moral violation stems from our deeply ingrained instinct to protect others from harm, which becomes distorted when we assume we possess superior knowledge about what constitutes a life worth living, leading us to override the most basic right of bodily autonomy in the name of mercy. We rationalize that since the person cannot consent, perhaps they would consent if they could understand their situation fully, which allows us to mentally reframe an act of killing into an act of care, transforming an unambiguous violation into something that feels justified and even noble. What makes this particularly unsettling is how this reasoning has been subtly normalized throughout history, from involuntary euthanasia programs in various nations to modern cases where families or healthcare providers quietly choose to withhold treatment or administer lethal doses based on their assessment of quality of life, often without formal consent procedures or legal oversight. Revealing how easily we can collectively agree to override consent when we believe we are acting in someone's best interest, suggesting that the protection of individual autonomy remains perpetually vulnerable to the seemingly reasonable inclination to decide for others. Imagine yourself on a lifeboat in the middle of the ocean, one of 15 people crammed into a vessel designed to safely hold only 10, and the boat is taking on water faster than the bilge pump can handle. You have perhaps 20 minutes before it becomes completely submerged, and there are only 8 life jackets remaining, though even with those jackets, the water temperature is so cold that hypothermia will claim anyone within minutes of entering it. The moral question emerges not as abstract philosophy, but as immediate, suffocating reality. Do you stay with the boat knowing you will likely die, or do you abandon it to give someone else a marginally better chance at survival, even though doing so might accelerate the vessel's sinking and doom those who remain? The psychological mechanism operating here involves the profound human tendency toward self-preservation conflicting directly with our internalized moral codes about loyalty, duty, and collective responsibility. We tell ourselves that staying means heroism, that abandoning ship constitutes cowardice or selfishness, yet the mathematics of survival often suggests that the moment of departure by those without life jackets accelerates the boat's trajectory toward complete submersion. This creates an agonizing paradox where the morally courageous act of remaining might paradoxically cause greater harm, while the seemingly cowardly act of leaving might actually increase overall survival rates. What makes this dilemma persist so powerfully in our moral imagination, despite its logical contradictions, is that we have romanticized maritime disaster into a narrative template where captains go down with ships, and the privileged sacrifice themselves for the vulnerable, yet real maritime history reveals that these scenarios rarely unfold according to such neat moral scripts, and most survivors describe confusion, panic, and decision-making entirely divorced from heroic nobility, suggesting that our persistent emotional attachment to the sinking ship narrative serves psychological needs that transcend actual survival mathematics. Consider the documentary filmmaker who spends months embedded with a family facing terminal illness, capturing their most intimate moments of suffering and grief, only to sell the finished film to streaming platforms for substantial profit, or the publisher who rushes to print a hastily written memoir by a survivor of a mass shooting, capitalizing on the public's morbid fascination while the wounds are still fresh. Or the social media influencer who live streams their emotional breakdown following a personal loss, garnering millions of views and consequently lucrative sponsorship deals from the engagement metrics that tragedy generates. These scenarios represent a fundamental paradox at the intersection of commerce and human suffering, where the market logic that rewards attention, viewership, and emotional resonance directly incentivizes the extraction of value from other people's pain. The mechanism operates through what we might call compassion capitalism, a system where empathy itself becomes a commodity that can be packaged, marketed, and monetized without any meaningful portion of the profits returning to those whose suffering made the product possible. We have constructed economic systems where tragedy is not merely reported or documented, but is actively sought out, sensationalized, and amplified because suffering generates engagement, and engagement generates revenue. The psychological component involves a peculiar cognitive dissonance, where we simultaneously believe ourselves to be moved by another person's misfortune, while remaining largely indifferent to the moral calculus of profiting from it. We have normalized this arrangement through language that obscures its nature, using terms like storytelling, awareness raising, and platform amplification to describe what is fundamentally an extraction of emotional labor and intimate pain from vulnerable people. Imagine a hiring manager who genuinely believes they are acting in the best interests of their organization and even in the best interests of fairness itself, yet their hiring decisions systematically exclude certain groups of people based on protected characteristics, all while they remain convinced of their own moral righteousness and progressive values. This manager might consciously avoid hiring candidates from certain neighborhoods because they believe those candidates lack the right cultural fit or the necessary soft skills that come from particular socioeconomic backgrounds, not recognizing that they are making sweeping assumptions based on geography and implicitly race or class. Alternatively, they might hesitate to hire women for physically demanding roles because they genuinely believe they are protecting women from unnecessary hardship, or they might pass over older candidates because they sincerely think younger employees will be more enthusiastic and adaptable, framing this as concern for the candidate's own well-being rather than age discrimination. The psychological mechanism at work here is profound and deeply human. We are all capable of constructing elaborate narratives that transform our biases into virtues, our prejudices into protections, and our discriminatory choices into expressions of wisdom and care. This happens because our brains are remarkably skilled at pattern recognition and confirmation bias, taking limited data points we have observed and constructing universal rules from them, then interpreting any evidence that contradicts those rules as exceptions rather than contradictions. What makes this particular dilemma so insidious is that the intent genuinely matters to the person making the decision, yet intent operates in a fundamentally different realm than impact, and the person being denied opportunity will experience the discrimination regardless of whether it was delivered with a smile or with suspicion. Consider a situation where public health authorities implement mandatory vaccination programs during disease outbreaks, requiring citizens to receive medical treatments regardless of personal preference, religious belief, or medical history, with potential legal consequences for noncompliance including fines, employment restrictions, or removal of children from schools. On one side stands the utilitarian argument that individual bodily autonomy must sometimes yield to collective survival, that the statistical lives saved through herd immunity justify overriding personal choice, and that those who refuse vaccines become vectors for disease that threatens vulnerable populations, including infants too young for vaccination and immunocompromised individuals who cannot safely receive certain treatments. On the other side exists the principle of informed consent, the foundation of modern medical ethics, which asserts that no medical procedure should be forced upon a person without voluntary agreement, that individuals possess inherent rights over their own bodies regardless of public benefit, and that coerced medical treatment represents a dangerous precedent that governments might extend to other interventions. The psychological mechanism underlying this dilemma involves competing moral intuitions that both feel fundamentally correct. The instinct to protect the collective from preventable harm conflicts directly with the instinct to defend individual sovereignty and resist state overreach into bodily integrity. What makes this particularly challenging is that both positions can point to historical atrocities to justify their stance, with one side citing public health successes that saved millions, and the other referencing forced sterilizations and medical experiments performed on marginalized populations under the guise of public good. Imagine a city where cameras monitor every street corner, every entrance, every moment of public movement, justified entirely by the promise that crime will decrease and safety will increase. Law enforcement agencies argue that constant surveillance acts as both a deterrent and an investigative tool, catching criminals in the act or providing evidence after crimes have occurred. Governments implement these systems with genuine intentions to protect citizens, and statistics often show correlations between increased surveillance and reduced crime rates in certain areas. Yet this creates a profound moral dilemma that sits at the intersection of safety and freedom, because we must ask ourselves whether the price of security is the surrender of privacy itself. The psychological mechanism driving this acceptance is rooted in what researchers call the security paradox. Our brains are wired to fear dramatic, visible threats like violent crime, and we are willing to tolerate invisible, gradual erosions of liberty to prevent those tangible dangers. When we see footage of a surveillance camera catching a criminal, we feel vindicated, our fear temporarily soothed, and we become less aware of the millions of moments when innocent people are observed without their knowledge or consent. We have normalized the idea that being watched is the price of being safe, that transparency of our movements is a reasonable exchange for the illusion of protection. What persists despite logical examination is our failure to recognize that surveillance systems, once established, rarely disappear, and their scope rarely shrinks. Governments and corporations that gain access to this monitoring infrastructure find endless reasons to expand it, redeploy it, or repurpose it in ways never originally intended. Consider the scenario where a government, institution, or collective authority decides that certain information, whether about historical events, scientific discoveries, medical treatments, or technological capabilities, is too dangerous for the general population to access, and therefore implements systematic restrictions on its distribution, teaching, and discussion. The justification typically rests on the premise that widespread knowledge of such information could lead to harm, whether through misuse, panic, social instability, or the empowerment of malicious actors, and this reasoning can sometimes appear reasonable when examining specific cases of genuinely hazardous technical information. The psychological mechanism at work here is rooted in what we might call asymmetric paternalism, the belief that those in positions of authority possess both superior judgment and the moral right to make decisions about what others should know, creating a protective barrier they believe prevents catastrophe. Yet this impulse contains a profound logical flaw, the assumption that restricting information actually prevents the problems it was meant to address, when in reality suppressed knowledge often circulates anyway through underground channels, becomes mythologized and distorted in the absence of official explanations, and breeds suspicion and conspiracy, thinking precisely because its absence creates a vacuum of official truth that people naturally rush to fill with speculation. What makes this dilemma particularly challenging is how we have normalized and institutionalized this impulse across our society without fully reckoning with its costs, embedding it into educational curricula that select which histories to emphasize, into medical systems that restrict patient access to certain information about their own conditions, into scientific communities that debate publication of potentially weaponizable research, and into corporate structures that classify information under the banner of proprietary protection. Consider the single mother working multiple jobs, earning just enough to keep her family housed and fed, yet watching her modest income taxed at rates that feel punitive when she is already choosing between medicine and meals. And imagine that she discovers a way to underreport her earnings, to claim false deductions, to redirect funds that would otherwise go to the government toward her children's education or health care. And she reasons that the wealthy evade taxes through legal loopholes, while she cannot afford the accountants to navigate those same systems. So is her choice truly different in moral weight or merely in legality? The psychological mechanism at work here is a form of moral relativism born from desperation, where the abstract obligation to contribute to the collective good becomes difficult to maintain when the immediate need to feed one's children feels infinitely more real and pressing than the distant concept of social responsibility, and the mind constructs a narrative of injustice, a story in which the system itself is already unfair, already stacked against people like her. So her participation in that unfairness is merely self-defense rather than moral transgression. What persists despite rational examination is the strange compartmentalization we maintain in modern society, where we simultaneously believe that tax evasion is wrong while sympathizing deeply with those who commit it out of genuine need, where we expect the poor to maintain moral standards that we ourselves might abandon in similar circumstances. Yet we rarely extend the same understanding to those who evade taxes through sophisticated financial structures and corporate vehicles. Suggesting that perhaps our actual moral code is not about the principle of paying what is owed, but rather about the visibility of the transgression and the social status of the transgressor, and this contradiction remains unresolved in our collective consciousness, never adequately explained or justified, simply existing as an uncomfortable tension between our professed values and our actual judgments. Imagine a factory where machines now perform the work that once required hundreds of human hands, or a customer service department where artificial intelligence answers calls with such precision that customers cannot distinguish between talking to an algorithm and speaking to a person, or a hospital where diagnostic systems read medical scans with greater accuracy than radiologists who spent decades perfecting their craft. This is not a distant future, but a present reality unfolding across industries from manufacturing to healthcare to creative work itself. The dilemma emerges not from whether this replacement will happen, but from our collective uncertainty about what we owe to those whose livelihoods vanish in its wake. We have constructed an economic system premised on the principle that efficiency and profit maximization are virtues worthy of pursuing above nearly all other considerations. And artificial intelligence represents the ultimate expression of this logic, executing tasks cheaper and faster than human workers ever could. The psychological mechanism underlying our acceptance of this replacement operates through a peculiar form of abstraction. We celebrate technological progress as inherently good, as the march of human ingenuity that has always lifted us forward, while simultaneously distancing ourselves from the concrete reality of individual workers losing income, purpose, and dignity. We convince ourselves that displaced workers will retrain for new jobs that do not yet exist, that economic disruption is merely temporary friction in a system that ultimately generates prosperity for all. Yet history demonstrates that technological displacement rarely redistributes benefits evenly and often deepens existing inequalities. What persists despite mounting evidence of its harm is the normalization of treating human worth as negotiable when weighed against shareholder returns, the assumption that market forces alone should determine whether someone's career becomes obsolete, and the implicit acceptance that those who cannot adapt to rapid technological change simply deserve their fate. Imagine a future society where genetic technology has advanced to the point where parents can select for intelligence in their offspring with near certainty, choosing embryos that carry genetic markers associated with higher cognitive ability, faster processing speed, and enhanced memory retention. A couple sits in a fertility clinic reviewing genetic reports on multiple viable embryos, each one ranked by predicted intelligence quotient scores, and they face the decision of which child to bring into existence. This scenario forces us to confront a deeply unsettling question. If we have the power to ensure our children are born with greater intellectual capacity, what makes it wrong to use that power, and conversely, what obligation do we have to do so? The psychological mechanism underlying this dilemma stems from our fundamental understanding of parental responsibility and love, which has traditionally meant doing everything in our power to give children the best possible start in life. We already select for health by avoiding genetic diseases. We already invest enormous resources in education and nutrition to maximize our children's potential. So the argument follows naturally that if a simple genetic choice could guarantee higher intelligence, deliberately choosing a less intelligent child would seem almost negligent, even cruel. Yet this logic, when extended fully, reveals the troubling implications of treating human traits as commodities to be optimized, transforming procreation from an act of acceptance into an act of consumer selection. Society has become increasingly comfortable with genetic screening for disease while maintaining firm ethical boundaries against enhancement. Yet these boundaries feel arbitrary and unstable upon examination, constantly shifting as technology improves and the cost of intervention decreases. Consider a nation under siege, facing existential threat from an invading force, where the military infrastructure has been decimated and adult soldiers are insufficient to hold defensive lines, and where young people, some barely in their teens, are conscripted or volunteer to fight for the survival of their homeland and families. The moral tension emerges immediately. We recognize that children lack the neurological development to consent to combat, that they suffer irreversible psychological trauma from warfare, and that international law explicitly prohibits their military deployment. Yet we simultaneously understand that a nation facing annihilation may rationalize their recruitment as a necessary evil to prevent genocide or complete subjugation. The psychological mechanism operates through what might be called defensive desperation, where existential threat compresses ethical boundaries and transforms the impermissible into the seemingly unavoidable, creating a framework where protecting children from warfare becomes secondary to protecting the nation from destruction. There exists also a paradoxical appeal to patriotism and belonging that can make military service feel like meaningful participation in collective survival rather than exploitation, particularly for young people who absorb the rhetoric of their communities and internalize the narrative that their sacrifice is noble rather than tragic. What persists despite overwhelming evidence of harm is the recurring pattern across history wherein nations in crisis have deployed child soldiers, suggesting that our commitment to protecting childhood remains conditional upon peacetime security, that abstract principles yield to immediate survival pressures, and that we have normalized a hierarchy in which national preservation supersedes developmental protection, creating a framework where the greatest taboo becomes accepting that sometimes. In our worst moments, we choose collective survival over individual innocence and tell ourselves this represents wisdom rather than the collapse of our most fundamental moral commitments. Consider the situation where a long-term partner asks you directly whether you have ever been unfaithful, and the truth is that you have, years ago, in a moment of weakness that you have since deeply regretted and worked through in solitude. And telling the truth now would shatter the foundation of trust that you have both spent a decade building together, while simultaneously lying would mean living with the knowledge that your relationship is built partially on deception, creating a paradox where honesty itself becomes the instrument of destruction rather than the foundation of intimacy. The psychological mechanism at work here is that we have been taught to believe that honesty and love are always compatible virtues, that truth-telling strengthens bonds and that deception weakens them. Yet this situation reveals a cruel complexity where the timing, context, and potential consequences of honesty can make it functionally equivalent to cruelty, transforming what should be a noble act into an act of sabotage disguised as integrity. The person asking the question may not actually want the truth, but rather wants reassurance, wants to feel secure, and may have posed the question in a moment when their insecurity briefly overwhelmed their wisdom, never truly expecting or desiring a confession that would require them to process trauma and potentially reconstruct their entire sense of who their partner is. What persists despite this logical impossibility is our cultural insistence that honesty is always the highest moral good, that secrets are inherently corrosive, that partners deserve total transparency at all times, yet we simultaneously recognize that some truths cause more damage than healing, that some pasts are better left examined privately rather than weaponized in relationships. And that mature love sometimes means protecting your partner from information that serves no purpose except to satisfy an abstract principle while destroying the actual living relationship that exists before you. Consider the scenario where a loved one has been kidnapped and the perpetrators demand money in exchange for their safe return. The family faces an agonizing choice: comply with the criminal's demands and secure the release of their family member, or refuse to pay and risk their loved one's death, while simultaneously denying resources to those who commit such heinous acts. This dilemma sits at the intersection of personal moral obligation and collective social responsibility, forcing individuals to weigh the irreplaceable value of a human life against the broader consequences of their actions. When a family pays ransom, they are directly funding the criminal enterprise that took their loved one, providing capital that will almost certainly be used to finance future abductions, to bribe officials, to purchase weapons, or to expand criminal operations that will inevitably harm other innocent people. Yet from the perspective of the desperate family member, the mathematics feels brutally simple. Paying the ransom has a clear and immediate benefit, the return of their beloved, while the broader societal harm remains abstract, distant, and uncertain. The psychological mechanism at work here is a form of temporal and spatial collapse, where the concrete present suffering of one identifiable person overwhelms consideration of the diffuse future suffering of many unknown potential victims. Our moral intuitions evolved in small communities where the people we could help were visible and named, not statistical projections, and this ancient wiring makes the screaming voice of someone we love more persuasive than the silent suffering of strangers. Governments and security experts often advocate against ransom payment precisely because historical data demonstrates that paying ransoms increases kidnapping rates, emboldening criminals, and creating a profitable market for abduction. Yet families continue to pay because the choice to let someone die when you have the means to save them feels psychologically intolerable regardless of the abstract consequences. Throughout history, governments and institutions have conducted medical and scientific experiments on incarcerated populations, viewing prisoners as convenient test subjects for procedures that would never be permitted on free citizens, ranging from pharmaceutical trials and surgical interventions to psychological manipulation and exposure to hazardous materials. With documented cases spanning from Nazi concentration camps to American prisons in the 20th century, where inmates were exposed to radiation, infected with diseases, or subjected to mind-altering drugs without informed consent. The mechanism underlying this practice appears rooted in a fundamental dehumanization process, wherein society places certain individuals outside the circle of moral consideration by virtue of their criminal status, creating a psychological framework in which their suffering becomes acceptable collateral damage in the pursuit of scientific knowledge that supposedly benefits the broader population. Once a person is labeled a criminal and removed from society, there exists a profound cognitive shift in how we perceive their rights and intrinsic value, transforming them from fellow humans deserving of protection into resources available for exploitation under the guise of research and progress. The justification typically revolves around utilitarian calculations. The temporary discomfort or danger experienced by a few prisoners, it is argued, yields data and treatments that will ultimately save countless lives in the general population, creating a moral hierarchy in which some lives are deemed less valuable and therefore more expendable. Yet what persists in this ethical calculus is a stubborn refusal to acknowledge that this framework legitimizes the abuse of the most vulnerable members of society, those least capable of refusing participation or seeking legal recourse, and it normalizes the notion that consent becomes negotiable when dealing with people society has already deemed disposable. Imagine a government facing what it perceives as an existential demographic crisis, where population growth threatens to outpace resources, infrastructure, and economic capacity. Rather than addressing root causes through education, economic development, or voluntary family planning programs, officials decide that the most efficient solution is to forcibly sterilize segments of the population deemed less desirable or productive. This has occurred throughout history in various nations, from early 20th century eugenics programs in Scandinavia and North America to more recent instances in developing nations where marginalized groups, ethnic minorities, or people with disabilities have been subjected to involuntary surgical procedures without informed consent. The underlying psychological mechanism driving such policies operates through a peculiar mathematical abstraction where individual human bodies become variables in a population equation, where their reproductive autonomy is reframed as a collective resource to be managed by the state rather than a fundamental human right. Officials justify these programs by constructing narratives about genetic improvement, resource scarcity, or national survival, transforming what is fundamentally a violation of bodily autonomy and human dignity into a technocratic solution that supposedly serves the greater good. What remains deeply troubling is how these practices have persisted in the modern era despite our advanced understanding of human rights, despite international conventions explicitly prohibiting such procedures, and despite overwhelming evidence that voluntary education and access to contraception are far more effective at achieving demographic goals. We have somehow normalized the notion that desperate circumstances justify desperate measures, that when faced with genuine challenges like population pressure or resource constraints, the violation of certain groups' fundamental rights becomes a reasonable policy option rather than an unconscionable breach of the social contract. Consider the village where generations have spoken their indigenous language, practiced their ancestral crafts, and maintained rituals that have shaped their identity for centuries, only to discover that economic opportunity requires assimilation into the dominant culture's ways, its language, its values, and its systems of commerce and communication. The parents face an agonizing choice: teach their children the old ways and risk condemning them to economic marginalization, or encourage them to abandon their heritage in pursuit of jobs, education, and material security that the modern world promises. This dilemma repeats itself across countless communities worldwide, where traditional cultures collide with the relentless forward march of globalized economics and technological advancement. The psychological mechanism underlying this sacrifice operates through a brutal calculus of survival and opportunity, where cultural preservation becomes framed as a luxury good that only the wealthy can afford, while those struggling for basic stability feel compelled to trade their identity for economic viability. We tell ourselves that progress is inevitable and that cultures must adapt or perish, yet this narrative conveniently ignores how power imbalances and economic systems deliberately incentivize this abandonment, making it seem like a natural choice rather than a forced one. What persists despite its logical fragility is the assumption that culture and progress exist in opposition, that we cannot simultaneously build modern infrastructure, develop economies, and maintain linguistic diversity or traditional knowledge systems, when in reality these are not inherently incompatible. We have normalized the extinction of cultures as a regrettable but necessary cost of development, rather than questioning whether our model of progress itself is fundamentally designed to erase difference and consolidate homogeneity, revealing perhaps that what we call progress is less about genuine advancement and more about the expansion of a particular cultural and economic system at the expense of all others. Consider a family that has practiced a particular religious or cultural ritual for generations, perhaps a coming-of-age ceremony that has always excluded members of a certain gender, or inheritance practice where property passes only to the eldest son, or a wedding tradition where one group of relatives contributes financially while another group is deliberately left without voice or choice in the proceedings. One generation comes to understand that this tradition, while beloved and meaningful to many, perpetuates an inequality that contradicts their values of fairness and inclusion. The dilemma becomes unbearably sharp when they must choose between honoring the voices of ancestors and honoring the dignity of living family members who are systematically excluded. Should they preserve what their grandparents and great-grandparents built, knowing that doing so means continuing to diminish and marginalize people they love, or should they risk breaking a chain that stretches back through generations, accepting that this rupture will cause grief and anger to those for whom tradition itself feels like identity? The psychological mechanism operates through what we might call inherited obligation, the sense that we are stewards rather than owners of our cultural practices, temporary guardians of something meant to outlast us. Yet this mechanism often fails to account for the weight it places on those who are excluded, the quiet internal violence of watching a ceremony that celebrates your family while systematically removing you from its center. We have normalized this tension by suggesting that tradition and equality exist on opposite sides of an impossible scale, when perhaps the deeper question is whether traditions that require inequality to survive deserve the survival we grant them. The question persists in our minds because it asks us to weigh loyalty against justice, continuity against growth, and respect for the past against responsibility to the present. Consider a scenario where severe famine ravages a region, where children collapse from malnutrition and families make impossible choices about which members might survive the coming weeks. Yet wealthy individuals and institutions in that same region or neighboring areas possess abundant food stores, medicine, and resources that could prevent widespread death, and instead of distributing these resources, they maintain strict control over their supplies, rationing them only to those who can pay premium prices or withholding them entirely to preserve their wealth and market position. This situation forces us to confront a fundamental tension between the legal right to property ownership and the moral obligation to prevent preventable human suffering when we possess the means to do so. The psychological mechanism that enables this behavior operates through several reinforcing layers. First, there is the abstraction of suffering itself, where distant or unseen death becomes statistically acceptable rather than viscerally real, allowing the mind to treat famine statistics as inevitable natural phenomena rather than preventable tragedies caused by specific decisions made by specific people. Second, there exists a powerful narrative of deservingness that frames survival itself as something that must be earned through market participation rather than guaranteed as a basic human right, which permits the wealthy to view their abundance as justified reward and the poor's deprivation as a natural consequence of economic failure rather than systemic inequality. Third, the legal and institutional frameworks that protect property rights function as moral shields, allowing individuals to point to abstract law as justification for actions that would otherwise be recognizable as allowing preventable death for profit. Consider the professional who stands at the threshold of an extraordinary opportunity, a promotion that promises advancement, financial security, and the fulfillment of years of dedicated work. Yet it demands relocation to another country for at least 5 years, during which time their aging parents will decline without their physical presence. Their children will grow through formative years with only video calls as connection. And their spouse will manage the household alone while building resentment in the silence of evening hours. This person must weigh the abstract promise of future stability and accomplishment against the concrete, irreplaceable moments of presence that family life demands, knowing that some opportunities come only once while family will always be there, and yet family will not wait indefinitely for someone who perpetually chooses tomorrow over today. The mechanism behind this dilemma operates through our cultural conditioning that measures human worth through professional achievement and external validation, while simultaneously recognizing that family relationships form the foundation of our emotional survival and meaning. We have constructed an economic system that forces this binary choice, that penalizes caregiving and rewards ambition, that tells us we can have both while structurally ensuring that we cannot, creating a psychological trap where guilt accompanies either decision we make. What persists as remarkable is how we have normalized this impossible choice, how we accept as inevitable the sacrifice of one fundamental human need for another, how we tell ourselves that success requires this cost, and that loving our families means accepting their loneliness, teaching them that work matters more than presence, while simultaneously expecting them to understand and support our absence. Creating generational patterns where children learn that achievement requires abandonment, and that love means accepting being left behind. Imagine you are a young adult citizen of a wealthy nation, born and raised within its borders, your entire life woven into its social fabric, your education paid for by its systems, your friendships formed in its schools, your career prospects shaped by its economy. Your parent, however, arrived in this country illegally decades ago, perhaps fleeing violence or poverty in their homeland, and has lived in the shadows ever since, working jobs that citizens avoid, paying taxes without claiming benefits, raising you with the values and work ethic that define you today. Then one day your parent is discovered, detained, and faces deportation to a country they left when you were an infant, a place you have never lived, whose language you barely speak, where they have no home, no job, and no remaining family or connections. The law is clear and unambiguous. They entered illegally and must leave. Yet the human reality is equally clear. Your parent is not a criminal in any meaningful sense, has harmed no one, has contributed more to society than many citizens, and their removal will shatter your family irreparably. This dilemma persists because it exists at the collision point between two different moral frameworks that rarely acknowledge each other's validity. The first framework emphasizes rule of law and national sovereignty, arguing that borders must be enforceable, and that allowing illegal immigration to succeed undermines the legitimacy of legal processes and the social contract itself. The second framework emphasizes human dignity and consequentialist ethics, arguing that enforcing law without regard for its devastating human impact is morally hollow, and that a person's value to their community and family should supersede their technical legal status. We have normalized this dilemma by accepting that the law itself is sufficient moral justification, yet we simultaneously acknowledge the profound injustice embedded within it, creating a permanent psychological tension that no policy seems capable of resolving. Consider the scenario where a military operation targets what intelligence suggests is a legitimate threat, perhaps a high-value combatant or weapons facility in a contested region. Yet the precision strike occurs in an area where civilian populations inevitably exist nearby, resulting in the deaths of non-combatants including children, elderly individuals, and families who had no connection to any military objective. The operator controlling the drone sits thousands of miles away in a climate-controlled facility, observing thermal signatures and movement patterns on a screen, making a split-second decision to authorize the strike based on incomplete information filtered through layers of bureaucratic approval and classified intelligence reports that may contain errors or outdated assessments. The underlying psychological mechanism that enables this action relies on several cognitive distortions. The distance between cause and consequence creates emotional detachment, transforming lethal force into an abstract technological exercise rather than a visible, immediate act of violence. The concept of collateral damage itself functions as linguistic abstraction, converting human deaths into acceptable statistical byproducts of military necessity, a mathematical equation where some number of civilian lives becomes justifiable when weighed against the potential threat elimination. We have normalized this paradox by framing it within utilitarian calculus, accepting the premise that protecting one's own population justifies the deaths of unknown others in distant lands. Yet this logic persists despite profound logical inconsistencies. We would never accept this same reasoning applied domestically, where a police officer could not legally eliminate a criminal suspect if civilians might be nearby. Yet international military operations operate under fundamentally different ethical and legal frameworks. Consider the parent who gives their child a toy or treat after the child has thrown a tantrum, screamed in a public place, or refused to listen to reasonable instruction, believing that this small reward will somehow calm the situation and restore peace to the household, at least temporarily. The logic seems almost reasonable in the moment of distress, a desperate attempt to regain control when chaos threatens to overwhelm, yet this act of appeasement plants a seed that will grow into an increasingly complex behavioral problem. The child's brain, still developing and learning how the world operates, receives a clear and unmistakable message. If you behave badly enough, loud enough, persistently enough, you will receive what you want. The reward becomes not a punishment for the bad behavior, but rather a prize, a trophy, a confirmation that the strategy works. This same principle appears in countless adult contexts, from the negotiator who pays a ransom to kidnapper, which simultaneously saves the hostage and ensures that future hostages will be taken because kidnapping has proven financially profitable, to the workplace where an employee who constantly threatens to quit and creates drama receives the first promotion because management wants to appease them and prevent further disruption. We see it in relationships where a partner who behaves selfishly or even abusively is showered with attention and gifts whenever they threaten to leave, creating a cycle where bad behavior is directly and immediately rewarded. The mechanism at work here is fundamentally one of reinforcement, the most basic principle of learning and behavior modification, yet despite our extensive scientific understanding of how reinforcement shapes behavior, we continue to reward the very actions we most want to eliminate. Perhaps we do this because the immediate relief of tension feels more pressing than the long-term consequences, or because we lack the patience to endure the temporary escalation that would occur if we simply held our boundaries without capitulation. Imagine a natural disaster has just struck your region, and within hours, bottled water that normally costs $2 per gallon is now selling for $15. Hand sanitizer that was previously $3 is now $20, and generators that cost $500 are being resold for $3,000 or more. A store owner or distributor faces a genuine moral crossroads. They have limited inventory of essential goods, demand has skyrocketed because people fear scarcity, and they possess the power to charge whatever the market will bear in that moment of desperation. The question becomes whether their right to maximize profit during humanity's vulnerability outweighs the basic human need for survival goods at reasonable prices. Some argue that higher prices actually serve a crucial function by rationing scarce resources efficiently, ensuring that goods go to those who need them most urgently rather than being depleted by panicked buyers who hoard unnecessarily. Others contend that this logic conveniently masks exploitation, that it prioritizes profit margins over human suffering, and that those with less money effectively lose access to life-saving supplies through no fault of their own. The psychological mechanism operates through a peculiar blend of economic rationalization and moral distancing. The seller tells themselves they are simply responding to market forces, that if they do not raise prices, competitors will, that they too have suffered losses and deserve compensation. Yet this justification requires ignoring the specific context of crisis, where normal market dynamics break down and desperation overrides genuine choice. Despite widespread condemnation and even legal restrictions against price gouging in many jurisdictions, The practice persists because the incentives remain irresistibly powerful and enforcement remains weak. We have normalized a system where survival itself becomes a commodity whose price fluctuates with panic, where those with resources weathered comfortably emerge even stronger, and where the vulnerable face impossible choices between necessities they cannot afford. Consider the historical moment when a nation emerges from the grip of systematic violence, when the perpetrators of atrocities walk among the survivors they have tortured, and the government faces an impossible choice: pursue justice through trials that could consume decades and destabilize a fragile peace, or offer amnesty to those who committed the worst imaginable crimes in exchange for truth and the cessation of violence. This scenario has played out across multiple continents, from post-apartheid South Africa to post-genocide Rwanda to post-conflict Northern Ireland, where Truth and Reconciliation Commissions offered conditional pardons to murderers and torturers who confessed their actions. The psychological mechanism underlying this dilemma operates on several interlocking levels, beginning with the recognition that perfect justice may be impossible when the scale of violence is so vast that traditional legal systems cannot accommodate it, combined with the pragmatic understanding that continued conflict and retribution spirals destroy more lives than forgiveness ever could. There exists within this framework a subtle reordering of moral hierarchy, where the prevention of future suffering takes precedence over the punishment of past suffering, where society essentially negotiates with evil by offering immunity in exchange for acknowledgement and the promise of no recurrence. What makes this situation particularly haunting is how it persists despite seeming to violate fundamental principles of justice and accountability that we hold sacred in our personal ethics. Yet we have learned to rationalize and normalize it through the lens of collective survival and the pragmatic calculation that some societies simply cannot afford the luxury of Nuremberg-style trials after massive upheaval. Consider the soldier standing in a conflict zone who receives an order from a commanding officer to execute a tactic or attack that they genuinely believe violates international law, targets civilians, or serves no legitimate military purpose. And imagine the psychological weight of that moment when personal conscience collides directly with the chain of command upon which military structure fundamentally depends. The dilemma emerges because soldiers take oaths to obey orders while simultaneously bound by laws of war and human rights conventions, creating a paradox where obedience and morality occupy opposing corners of the same room. If the soldier obeys, they become complicit in what they perceive as an atrocity, carrying that moral burden forever into their retirement and personal life. Yet if they refuse, they face court-martial, imprisonment, discharge, or in some nations, execution, and they also potentially destabilize the military hierarchy that protects their unit and comrades who depend on unified command structure for survival. The psychological mechanism underlying this dilemma roots itself in the tension between authority and autonomy, between the legitimate need for unified command in combat situations where split-second decisions determine life and death, and the equally legitimate moral imperative that individuals should never become instruments of injustice without exercising independent judgment. Throughout history, from Nazi Germany to contemporary conflicts, soldiers have claimed they were simply following orders, and the world has collectively rejected this defense while simultaneously asking soldiers to follow orders absolutely, creating an impossible expectation that persists without resolution. Consider the scenario where you witness concerning signs of abuse occurring to someone you know, perhaps a colleague at work, a neighbor, or even a distant family member. And yet you choose not to report it, not to intervene, and not to speak about what you have observed to anyone who might help. The abuser continues their behavior undetected and uninterrupted, emboldened by the knowledge that their actions remain hidden within the walls of private spaces, and the victim endures their suffering in isolation, believing that nobody notices or cares. The mechanism that enables this silence to persist is fundamentally rooted in psychological self-protection. We convince ourselves that intervention is not our responsibility, that we lack sufficient evidence, that speaking up might damage our own social standing or create uncomfortable confrontation, or that the victim themselves has never explicitly asked for our help, and therefore our silence respects their autonomy. We construct elaborate justifications for inaction by appealing to concepts like privacy, uncertainty, and the boundaries between intervention and meddling. Yet these same justifications become the invisible architecture supporting the abuser's continued harm. What makes this particularly troubling is how normalized this silence has become across cultures and communities. We have somehow accepted the notion that witnessing potential harm places no meaningful obligation upon us, that our comfort and convenience outweigh another person's safety, and that the consequences of our passivity belong entirely to others rather than partly to ourselves. The victim, in turn, often interprets silence as confirmation that their suffering is either invisible, unimportant, or deserved, which deepens their isolation and their belief that seeking help would be futile. We rarely examine how our silence, multiplied across dozens or hundreds of people who notice something amiss, transforms into a protective barrier around the abuser, allowing them to operate with impunity because nobody breaks the collective quiet. Imagine a scenario where a child suffers from a treatable bacterial infection, yet their parents refuse the prescribed antibiotics because those antibiotics were developed using cell lines derived from aborted fetal tissue decades ago, or because the pharmaceutical company has engaged in morally questionable practices unrelated to this particular medication, or because accepting this treatment feels like a betrayal of deeply held convictions about how medicine should be produced and distributed. The child's condition worsens, complications set in, and a preventable tragedy unfolds. This represents one of the most profound moral paradoxes in modern healthcare, the collision between ethical consumption and immediate human welfare. The mechanism driving such decisions operates through what might be called moral consistency seeking, wherein individuals prioritize alignment with their stated values and belief systems over pragmatic outcomes that contradict those values. A person may genuinely believe that supporting certain pharmaceutical companies enables future harm, or that accepting treatments derived from ethically questionable sources makes them complicit in ongoing moral violations, and therefore rejecting such treatment becomes an act of integrity rather than denial. The psychological architecture here involves a form of principled reasoning where the abstract principle of moral purity or ethical consistency becomes weighted more heavily than the concrete, immediate consequences facing the suffering individual before them. What makes this dilemma so unsettling is how rarely we examine it directly, how we've normalized the idea that personal moral positioning can justify rejecting effective interventions, and how we simultaneously acknowledge that outcomes matter while constructing moral frameworks where certain outcomes are acceptable sacrifices on the altar of principle. The tension persists because both positions contain legitimate ethical weight. Concerns about corporate malfeasance and exploitative practices are genuine, yet so is the fundamental obligation to prevent suffering when effective means exist. Consider the scenario where medical resources are limited and difficult decisions must be made about who receives treatment, who receives priority in emergency services, or who receives funding for research into their conditions. In these moments, societies often make the implicit choice to prioritize younger individuals over elderly individuals, allocating organs for transplant to those with decades ahead rather than those in their final years, directing vaccines first to younger populations, or investing research dollars into conditions that affect the young while neglecting diseases that primarily afflict the old. This pattern emerges across healthcare systems, disaster response protocols, and even in how we allocate social attention and cultural resources. The mechanism driving this prioritization operates on several levels simultaneously. There exists a utilitarian calculation where the years of life gained by saving a young person statistically exceeds the years gained by saving an elderly person, making the mathematical case for youth seem compelling and rational. Simultaneously, evolutionary psychology suggests we are drawn to protect those most capable of reproduction and continuation of our lineages, creating deep biological instincts that favor youth. There is also the reality that younger individuals have not yet had opportunities to live full lives, triggering a sense that preventing their death represents a prevention of tragedy, while an elderly person's death may feel like a natural culmination of their existence. Yet despite these seemingly logical underpinnings, we rarely examine the embedded assumption that a longer potential lifespan automatically possesses greater moral weight than a life already richly lived. We have normalized this hierarchy so thoroughly that it operates largely invisibly, embedded in our policies and systems without substantial societal debate, creating a world where the elderly gradually become deprioritized not through conscious moral deliberation, but through the quiet acceptance of assumptions we inherited without questioning whether they truly reflect the values we claim to hold. Imagine that your parent or relative has passed away and left you a substantial inheritance, perhaps a house, investments, or significant wealth that will fundamentally change your financial security and life trajectory. You discover, however, that this money was accumulated through deeply unethical or illegal means. Perhaps they were involved in organized crime, human trafficking, weapons smuggling, or exploitation of vulnerable workers across decades. The money itself is real, the inheritance is legally yours, and the practical benefit to your life is undeniable, yet every dollar carries the weight of genuine human suffering. The dilemma becomes whether accepting this inheritance makes you morally complicit in the harm that generated it, or whether the money has been sufficiently removed from its origins that using it for your own purposes is ethically distinct from the original crime. This situation forces you to confront the uncomfortable reality that moral purity and practical survival sometimes exist in direct opposition to one another, because rejecting the inheritance does not undo the suffering that created it, nor does it return anything to the victims or their families. The psychological mechanism underlying this dilemma operates through what philosophers call the problem of tainted goods and moral contamination. We instinctively feel that objects or money associated with wrongdoing carry a kind of moral stain that cannot be washed away through mere transfer of ownership, yet we simultaneously recognize that money itself is fundamentally fungible and neutral, with no inherent moral quality beyond the intentions of those who use it. The inheritance presents a paradox where refusing the money feels like a moral gesture that accomplishes nothing concrete, while accepting it feels like a betrayal of your own values, creating a situation where every choice leaves you feeling complicit or hypocritical. Imagine you are a criminal defense attorney, and you take on a client whom you know with absolute certainty has committed the crime for which they stand accused, perhaps through their own confession in your private office, or through evidence so overwhelming that denial becomes impossible, and yet your professional duty compels you to mount the most vigorous defense possible, to challenge every piece of evidence, to cross-examine witnesses aggressively, and to exploit any procedural weakness in the prosecution's case. All while knowing that your skillful advocacy might result in a guilty person walking free into society, potentially to harm others again. The psychological mechanism at work here operates on the principle of systemic role separation, wherein we construct elaborate justifications for compartmentalizing our personal morality from our professional obligations, reasoning that the justice system functions properly only when both prosecution and defense perform their designated roles with equal intensity, and that allowing our knowledge of guilt to influence our advocacy would somehow corrupt the entire apparatus of law and make it unreliable for everyone. We convince ourselves that our responsibility is not to truth or justice directly, but rather to the system itself, to ensuring proper procedure and rigorous examination, trusting that truth will emerge through adversarial competition even though we possess knowledge suggesting otherwise. Yet this practice persists despite its logical fragility, because we have normalized the idea that institutional roles can and should override individual moral agency, that the collective system matters more than individual instances of harm prevention, and that a lawyer's personal belief in a client's guilt is irrelevant to their professional duty, creating a strange world in which the person who knows most about the crime's reality acts as though they know nothing at all. And we accept this profound contradiction as not only necessary but righteous. Imagine a family arrives at your door seeking shelter from violence, persecution, or humanitarian catastrophe in their homeland, and you have the physical capacity to house them, yet you choose not to, citing reasons of personal inconvenience, resource scarcity, fear of the unknown, or simple preference for maintaining your current life without disruption. This scenario presents one of the most fundamental moral tensions in contemporary ethics, because it forces us to confront the gap between our abstract commitment to human dignity and our concrete willingness to sacrifice comfort for another person's survival. The psychological mechanism underlying this dilemma operates through what philosophers call moral distancing, wherein we create psychological and conceptual barriers between ourselves and those in need, allowing us to acknowledge their suffering while simultaneously exempting ourselves from responsibility for addressing it. We convince ourselves through various rationalization strategies that their crisis is not truly our concern, that governments or international organizations should handle such matters, that our own security might be threatened, or that helping one family means we cannot help others, thereby spreading responsibility so thin that no individual bears any. This reasoning persists despite having considerable logical fragility, because human beings are fundamentally tribal creatures whose empathy operates with a proximity bias, meaning we feel deeper responsibility for those closest to us and progressively less for distant strangers, and we have normalized this bias by building entire legal and social systems around it. We have made citizenship and national borders into moral boundaries, such that a person born on one side of an invisible line deserves sanctuary, while a person born on the other side does not. And we accept this arrangement as natural, rather than recognizing it as a collective decision. We continue to reinforce every single day through our choices to prioritize national interest over universal human need. Consider the scenario where pharmaceutical companies and research institutions conduct clinical trials in impoverished communities, offering modest payments or free medical treatment to participants who may not fully understand the risks involved or who feel compelled by their desperate circumstances to accept experimental procedures they would otherwise refuse. These individuals, lacking access to adequate health care and living paycheck to paycheck, become willing test subjects not out of genuine informed consent, but out of necessity, their vulnerability transformed into a research asset. The mechanism at work here involves a fundamental asymmetry of power and information, where those conducting research possess complete knowledge of potential dangers, while participants often receive simplified explanations or omit crucial details about side effects, long-term consequences, or the speculative nature of treatments. The researchers justify this arrangement through utilitarian reasoning, arguing that advancing medical science requires human subjects and that offering compensation to economically disadvantaged people represents a form of benefit to them. Yet this logic obscures how desperation undermines genuine choice. What makes this dilemma persist despite its obvious ethical problems is how we have constructed an entire system that depends on this exploitation, while maintaining plausible deniability through bureaucratic oversight and institutional review boards that typically include few, if any, members from the communities being studied. The poor serve as the raw material for scientific progress while remaining isolated from its benefits, and we have normalized this arrangement by framing it as charitable opportunity rather than exploitation, by emphasizing the advancement of human knowledge over the actual human beings bearing the risks, and by maintaining comfortable distance between decision-makers and the consequences faced by participants who have no real alternative but to accept whatever terms are offered. Consider the designer sitting in a corporate office, tasked with creating a social media feed that keeps users engaged for hours beyond their intended browsing time, or the engineer refining notification algorithms to trigger dopamine responses that feel urgent and irresistible, or the product manager deliberately implementing variable reward schedules borrowed directly from slot machine psychology into a mobile application meant for general audiences. These professionals are not typically malicious individuals, yet they are architecting systems designed with deliberate psychological vulnerabilities in mind, creating products engineered to hijack attention and habit formation pathways in the human brain. The mechanism is well understood and extensively documented. Intermittent reinforcement schedules, the same principle that makes gambling addictive, are embedded into likes, comments, and unpredictable content algorithms. Infinite scroll functions eliminate the natural stopping points that our brains evolved to recognize. Notification badges and red dots exploit our cognitive bias toward incomplete information. And personalization engines learn precisely which content manipulates each individual most effectively. What makes this dilemma particularly unsettling is that we have largely normalized and accepted this arrangement as an inevitable feature of modern technology rather than a deliberate choice made by companies with full knowledge of the consequences. We rationalize that users have agency and can simply put down their devices, yet neuroscience demonstrates that these designs override voluntary control mechanisms at a fundamental level, making the comparison to addiction scientifically appropriate rather than hyperbolic. The industry persists in this pattern despite mounting evidence of psychological harm, particularly in adolescence, because the engagement metrics that fuel these addictive mechanisms directly correlate with advertising revenue and shareholder value, creating a system where the most ethically questionable design choices are simultaneously the most profitable ones. Consider the physician who possesses intimate knowledge of human physiology, pharmacology, and the vulnerabilities of the human body. And imagine that this person decides to use this knowledge not to heal, but to harm, perhaps administering lethal injections disguised as routine medications, or prescribing dosages calculated to induce organ failure while maintaining the appearance of natural causes, or exploiting their trusted position to access vulnerable patients in hospitals where oversight is minimal and suffering can be attributed to existing conditions. The moral dilemma emerges from the catastrophic violation of the fundamental trust that allows medicine to function at all, since patients must believe their physicians are acting in their best interest, and yet the very expertise required to save lives is precisely the expertise required to end them with extraordinary precision and minimal detection. The psychological mechanism that makes this particularly insidious is that medical knowledge creates a power asymmetry where the patient is entirely dependent on the physician's integrity. And when that integrity is compromised, the person with the most knowledge about how to cause suffering also has the most legitimate access to victims and the most credible explanations for their deaths. We see this reflected throughout history in cases of physicians who murdered patients over extended periods, their crimes sometimes only discovered after dozens of deaths, because the medical establishment and the public presumed that someone who dedicated their life to healing would not weaponize that knowledge for personal gratification or revenge. Yet the same educational systems, licensing boards, and institutional structures that are designed to prevent this recognize that no amount of screening or oversight can completely eliminate the possibility that someone with medical expertise will eventually choose to abuse it. And we have largely accepted this risk as an unavoidable cost of having a medical profession at all, continuing to invest profound trust in individuals whose knowledge makes them uniquely capable of betrayal. Consider the parent who abandons their child for years, providing no financial support, no emotional presence, no acknowledgement of their existence, only to return when the child has reached adulthood or achieved some measure of success, suddenly offering reconciliation and claiming they have changed, asking for forgiveness and another chance at relationship. A scenario that forces us to confront what redemption actually means, and whether the passage of time and expressed remorse can genuinely erase the formative wounds of abandonment. The psychological mechanism underlying this dilemma centers on our deep human need to believe in transformation and second chances, the idea that people are not permanently fixed by their worst actions, combined with our equally deep need for accountability and recognition of harm, creating a fundamental tension between mercy and justice that rarely resolves neatly. When a parent returns seeking reconnection, they often frame it through the lens of their own growth, their own struggles, their own redemptive arc, yet this necessarily shifts focus away from the decades of suffering the abandoned child endured, the missing school events, the financial struggles, the psychological impact of feeling fundamentally unworthy of parental love, the internalized belief that they were not enough to be claimed. What makes this dilemma particularly challenging is that we have culturally normalized a peculiar asymmetry where the returning parent's courage to reach out is celebrated as admirable, where the child's hesitation or refusal to reconcile is often pathologized as bitterness or inability to forgive, when in reality the child is simply establishing boundaries around their own emotional and psychological safety. We rarely pause to examine whether forgiveness without restitution is genuinely healing, or whether it simply allows the parent to feel absolved, while leaving the child to continue managing the unresolved trauma of their childhood abandonment. Imagine a young person who commits a serious crime, perhaps driven by desperation, trauma, or circumstance rather than inherent malice, and you are tasked with deciding whether society's response should be designed to reform them back into a functioning member of that society, or whether it should be designed primarily to make them suffer in proportion to the harm they caused. This dilemma cuts to the heart of how we construct our justice systems and reveals something profound about what we believe punishment is actually for. On one hand, rehabilitation operates from the premise that people can change, that understanding the root causes of criminal behavior and addressing them through education, therapy, and skill development will reduce recidivism and ultimately protect society more effectively than warehousing individuals in cages where they grow more hardened and more dangerous. On the other hand, retribution operates from a deeper moral intuition that wrongdoing creates a kind of cosmic imbalance that must be corrected through suffering, that victims and society deserve to witness proportional pain inflicted upon the perpetrator, and that without this element of just deserts, we are somehow failing in our moral obligation to acknowledge the gravity of what occurred. The psychological mechanism here involves competing neural systems within human morality. Our capacity for compassion and understanding activates when we consider the rehabilitation path, allowing us to see the criminal as a flawed human capable of growth, while our sense of justice and fairness activates when we consider punishment, triggering an almost visceral need to see wrongs made right through suffering. Consider the scenario where a person from a dominant culture adopts aesthetic, artistic, or spiritual elements from a marginalized culture, often profiting from or gaining social status through these adoptions, while members of the origin culture face discrimination for the same practices. A white musician incorporates African American musical traditions into their work and receives Grammy recognition and substantial financial reward, while black artists who pioneered those same techniques struggled for decades to achieve basic recognition and fair compensation. A fashion designer creates a collection inspired by Native American ceremonial dress, presenting it as haute couture on international runways, while indigenous peoples are prohibited from wearing their traditional regalia in certain public spaces or face social ridicule. The psychological mechanism operating here involves power differentials and systemic access. Dominant groups possess cultural capital, distribution networks, and social permissions that allow them to repackage marginalized cultural elements as novel or sophisticated, thus extracting value that the originating communities cannot access due to historical exclusion from those same institutions. The dominant group's appropriation often strips cultural elements of their original context, meaning, and spiritual significance, transforming sacred or deeply meaningful practices into decorative aesthetics or entertainment. What makes this dilemma persistently challenging is that culture has always flowed between communities, and human creativity naturally builds upon existing traditions, making it difficult to establish clear boundaries between respectful appreciation and exploitative appropriation. We have normalized a system where the same cultural expression carries radically different social consequences depending on who performs it, yet we struggle to articulate consistent ethical guidelines that honor both cultural origins and creative freedom, leaving individuals uncertain about when engagement with other cultures constitutes appreciation versus violation. Consider the scenario where a charitable organization decides to raise money for a worthy cause by hosting an event where attractive volunteers or hired models are displayed primarily for their physical appearance, with their bodies serving as the central marketing tool to attract donors and generate publicity. The organization frames this approach as necessary and justified because the funds collected will genuinely help vulnerable populations, feed hungry children, or fund critical medical research, creating a paradox where the means of exploitation appears morally permissible because the ends are undeniably noble. The psychological mechanism at work here involves a form of moral licensing, where individuals and institutions convince themselves that because their ultimate goal is altruistic, the objectification that occurs along the way becomes acceptable or even praiseworthy, transforming what would otherwise be recognized as reducing a person to their aesthetic value into something that feels like community spirit and charitable commitment. The donors themselves experience a curious cognitive dissonance where they might simultaneously feel uncomfortable with the objectification while also feeling virtuous about their contributions, effectively compartmentalizing the ethical dimension because the positive outcome provides psychological justification for the uncomfortable method. This dynamic persists in modern society despite our stated commitment to human dignity and respect precisely, because we have developed elaborate frameworks for rationalizing it, convincing ourselves that consent and good intentions somehow erase the fundamental nature of what occurs when human worth becomes instrumentalized for financial gain. We normalize this contradiction by rarely acknowledging it directly, by framing it as practical necessity rather than ethical compromise, and by allowing the importance of the charitable cause to eclipse any serious reflection on whether there might be alternative approaches that achieve the same financial goals without requiring people to trade their dignity for donations. Imagine you are a hiring manager at a prestigious firm, and two candidates sit before you with nearly identical qualifications, education, and experience. Yet one is the nephew of your company's founder, while the other is a stranger with no family connections to anyone in power. The nephew might genuinely possess the skills needed for the role, but you know that hiring him sends a message to your organization that bloodlines matter more than ability, that the accident of birth trumps the deliberate cultivation of talent, and yet something in the institutional structure, the unspoken rules that have governed organizations since their inception, makes the choice feel almost inevitable rather than consciously chosen. This scenario reveals a fundamental tension between two competing systems of human organization. Nepotism, which allocates resources, opportunities, and positions based on familial relationships and personal connections, and meritocracy, which theoretically distributes these same opportunities based purely on demonstrated ability, talent, and achievement. The psychological mechanism that sustains this dilemma operates on multiple levels simultaneously, beginning with the cognitive ease of favoring those we know and trust. Since our brains are wired to privilege in-group members and family bonds as reliable and safe, making nepotism feel like a natural extension of the loyalty we already feel toward our loved ones. Beyond this personal psychology lies the structural reality that power, wealth, and opportunity tend to cluster within families and networks, creating compounding advantages where those born into privilege receive better education, more mentorship, stronger professional networks, and often literal capital to invest in their futures, which then allows them to succeed more easily and to justify their success as earned rather than inherited. Consider the historical moment when a newly elected leader faces the question of whether to prosecute their political opponents for crimes committed during their time in power, or whether to extend forgiveness and move forward with reconciliation rather than retribution. This dilemma has emerged repeatedly across nations and centuries, from post-apartheid South Africa to post-conflict societies emerging from civil war, to democracies where one political party has committed documented abuses while holding office. The tension exists between two seemingly incompatible moral imperatives: the demand for justice that victims deserve and the pragmatic recognition that pursuing vengeance might destabilize a fragile new government or prevent the genuine healing that a society desperately needs. The psychological mechanism underlying this conflict appears to operate on multiple levels simultaneously, where our sense of fairness and accountability competes directly with our survival instinct and our recognition that perfect justice is often impossible in the real world. We are programmed to believe that wrongdoing must be punished, that victims must be validated through prosecution, and that allowing perpetrators to escape consequences represents a failure of moral order. Yet we simultaneously understand that societies can collapse under the weight of endless cycles of retribution. What persists most mysteriously is our cultural inability to hold both truths at once. Our insistence that either justice or peace must be sacrificed entirely, rather than accepting that sometimes deeply imperfect compromises become the only path forward. We have normalized the idea that forgiveness requires forgetting, when perhaps the harder and more realistic choice involves remembering while choosing not to perpetuate harm, acknowledging that vindication need not always wear the face of punishment. Consider the fundamental paradox at the heart of water privatization. A resource essential for human survival, one that falls from the sky and flows through the earth without regard for ownership or profit, becomes packaged into a commodity controlled by corporations with fiduciary duties to shareholders rather than to the populations they serve. In cities across the globe, from Manila to Paris to Detroit, municipal water systems have been transferred to private companies through long-term contracts, creating situations where access to clean drinking water becomes contingent upon the ability to pay market rates, where profit margins matter more than universal coverage, and where the poorest citizens often face higher prices or service disconnections when they cannot afford the bills. The mechanism underlying this arrangement rests on a deceptively simple economic logic. Private companies operate with greater efficiency, reduce bureaucratic waste, and mobilize capital that cash-strapped municipalities cannot access themselves, arguments that appeal to desperate city administrators facing crumbling infrastructure and empty budgets. Yet the psychological mechanism that sustains water privatization, despite mounting evidence of its failures, involves a fundamental reframing of how we conceptualize necessity itself, transforming water from a basic human right into a consumer good subject to the same market forces that govern luxury items. And this reframing feels almost invisible because we have already normalized the privatization of so many other essential services that we barely question it anymore. We have come to accept that corporations can own and control the infrastructure through which we receive the water we need to survive, that they can set prices, determine service areas, and prioritize profit over accessibility. And this normalization persists despite the clear historical record of service deterioration, price increases, and systematic exclusion of vulnerable populations that follows privatization agreements across different countries and continents. Consider the experience of purchasing a packaged steak from a supermarket shelf, where the flesh has been carefully trimmed, wrapped in plastic, and labeled with a price per pound, stripped entirely of any resemblance to the living animal from which it originated. The consumer reaches for this product without witnessing the animal's existence, without confronting the slaughter process, without seeing the moment of death that made this transaction possible, and this psychological distance between the act of consumption and the act of killing is perhaps the most fundamental mechanism that allows meat eating to persist as a normalized practice across billions of people globally. The human mind has developed a remarkable capacity for compartmentalization, where we can simultaneously love animals as companions and pets while consuming them as food without experiencing significant cognitive dissonance. A phenomenon sustained through linguistic abstraction, where we use separate words for the living creature, the animal, and the flesh we eat, the meat, so that the connection between them becomes intellectually obscured even when it remains logically identical. We have constructed an entire infrastructure of removed responsibility, where farmers raise the animals, slaughterhouses kill them, processors butcher them, corporations package them, and individual consumers simply purchase a product that appears to have no causal relationship to suffering. And this fragmentation of the chain allows each participant to experience diminished moral responsibility for the whole, believing themselves merely one small actor in a system too large to resist or change. Consider the peculiar arrangement that exists in certain African nations where wealthy hunters from developed countries pay substantial sums, sometimes exceeding $100,000, for the opportunity to kill endangered or vulnerable animals, with the understanding that a portion of these fees will fund conservation efforts that protect the very species they are hunting. A wealthy businessman travels thousands of miles to shoot a lion or rhinoceros, and the money from this transaction theoretically goes toward anti-poaching patrols, habitat protection, and breeding programs designed to ensure these species survive into future generations. The logic appears airtight on its surface. Generate revenue from wildlife through lethal means, then use that revenue to preserve wildlife through protective means, creating a financial incentive structure where the animal's death becomes the mechanism for the species' survival. Wildlife managers argue that without this income, local communities would have no economic reason to tolerate large predators on their land, leading to retaliatory killings and habitat destruction, whereas trophy hunting creates value in living animals and funds the infrastructure necessary to protect them. Yet beneath this rational framework lies a psychological mechanism that normalizes a profound contradiction. We have come to accept that the most direct form of harm to an individual creature can somehow serve as the optimal path to species preservation. This arrangement persists partly because it allows multiple parties to satisfy competing interests simultaneously. The hunter achieves their desired experience, the operator profits substantially, the conservation organization gains funding, and the species theoretically benefits, creating a coalition of stakeholders united around an activity that would otherwise seem morally indefensible. Consider the scenario in which a billionaire establishes a charitable foundation, donating a portion of their wealth while simultaneously receiving substantial tax deductions that reduce their overall tax liability to nearly nothing, allowing them to maintain control over the foundation's assets and decide which causes receive funding, often selecting organizations that align with their personal interests or enhance their public image. While the tax savings they receive could theoretically have gone to public services like education, healthcare, or infrastructure that benefit the broader population. This practice exists within legal boundaries in most developed nations, yet it represents a peculiar moral inversion where the wealthiest citizens are incentivized to give away their own money in exchange for compensation from the state, in the form of reduced taxation, essentially allowing private individuals to redirect public resources toward their preferred causes rather than democratically determined ones. The psychological mechanism that sustains this system relies on the celebration of generosity itself, transforming what is fundamentally a financial transaction into a narrative of benevolence and moral leadership, so that a billionaire who donates $10 million while saving $50 million in taxes is lauded as a philanthropist rather than examined as someone who effectively negotiated a profitable arrangement with the government. We have normalized this contradiction by separating the tax benefit from the donation in our minds, treating them as independent moral acts rather than interconnected financial mechanics, allowing donors to feel virtuous about giving while simultaneously allowing governments to frame the lost revenue as acceptable because it technically came from voluntary donation rather than mandatory taxation. Imagine yourself sitting in a self-driving car traveling at highway speed when suddenly the vehicle's sensors detect an unavoidable collision ahead. The autonomous system must choose between swerving left into a family of 4 crossing legally in the crosswalk, swerving right into a single elderly pedestrian jaywalking, or braking hard and risking a rear-end collision that could kill its own occupants. The car has mere milliseconds to compute this utilitarian calculus, and whatever algorithm governs its decision will result in someone's death. The manufacturer programmed it to minimize total casualties, so it calculates probabilities of survival for each scenario and chooses the path that statistically saves the most lives. In this instance, that means deliberately steering toward the elderly jaywalker, sacrificing 1 life to save 4. Now consider that you are the elderly pedestrian who has been selected for death by mathematics, or you are the parent of the child in the crosswalk whose family was rejected by an optimization function. The psychological mechanism underlying this dilemma traces back to the trolley problem, that ancient thought experiment where you stand beside a lever controlling train tracks and must choose whether to actively divert a runaway train toward 1 person to save 5 others. For over a century, philosophers have debated whether there is a meaningful moral difference between actively causing harm and passively allowing harm to occur, between commission and omission, between being a killer and being a bystander. Yet somehow we have reached an era where this abstract philosophical puzzle has become concrete automotive engineering policy, where manufacturers must literally encode their answer to this question into machine learning models and mathematical formulas that will govern real deaths on real streets. We have normalized the idea that companies can pre-program machines to kill specific categories of people based on algorithms, so long as those algorithms claim to save more lives overall. Consider the person who has spent decades within a family system marked by emotional manipulation, verbal abuse, financial exploitation, or psychological control, and who arrives at a point where they recognize that continued contact brings only harm to their well-being and mental health. Yet they choose to simply disappear without explanation, without confrontation, without the conversation that closure might demand. They stop answering calls and messages, they remove themselves from group chats, they create distance not through honest dialogue but through silence, and in doing so they mirror the very communication patterns that made the family toxic in the first place. The mechanism underlying this choice operates on several levels. First, there is the recognition that direct confrontation with a toxic family member often proves futile because the family member lacks the psychological capacity or willingness to genuinely hear criticism or accept responsibility. Second, there is the fear that any explanation will be weaponized, twisted, or used as ammunition in future interactions. And third, there is the simple exhaustion of knowing that engaging in conversation requires emotional labor that one simply no longer possesses. Yet what makes this dilemma genuinely troubling is how we have come to normalize ghosting as a legitimate form of boundary setting while simultaneously condemning it as cowardly or cruel when family relationships are involved. We celebrate the ability to cut off toxic friends or romantic partners through silence, recognizing that sometimes people do not deserve our explanations, and yet we simultaneously insist that family deserves something more, deserves the courtesy of words and reasoning, even though family relationships are precisely where the power dynamics often make such conversations most dangerous or futile. Imagine you are a physician who has just received definitive test results confirming that your patient has 6 months to live, perhaps less, and the disease will be both painful and debilitating in its final stages. The patient sits across from you in the examination room, hopeful, trusting your expertise, asking whether the results came back normal. You now face an immediate decision that will fundamentally alter the trajectory of their remaining life. Do you tell them the complete truth about their prognosis, or do you soften the message, offer ambiguous language, perhaps suggest they seek a second opinion first, or even delay the conversation until they are psychologically prepared, which may never actually come? The dilemma cuts deeper because you recognize that knowing about terminal illness can trigger immediate psychological devastation, existential panic, and a self-fulfilling prophecy where despair itself accelerates decline. Yet withholding truth denies them agency over their final months, the ability to reconcile relationships, arrange affairs, pursue bucket list experiences, or prepare spiritually for what comes next. The mechanism underlying this conflict emerges from a fundamental tension between our impulse to protect people from pain and our obligation to respect their autonomy as conscious beings entitled to information about their own existence. Medical ethics has long grappled with this paradox, teaching physicians to balance beneficence with respect for persons, though the scales tip differently depending on cultural context, individual values, and the specific patient before you. What makes this dilemma persist despite centuries of philosophical examination is that there exists no objectively correct answer that satisfies all competing goods simultaneously. Some patients genuinely do not want to know, some would feel devastated by delay, some will interpret withholding as patronizing or paternalistic, and some physicians themselves struggle with the existential weight of delivering catastrophic news. Consider a family whose deeply held religious beliefs prohibit medical treatment, including vaccines and blood transfusions, which they view as violations of divine law. And yet these same beliefs directly endanger not only their own children, but also vulnerable members of their community who cannot protect themselves through vaccination, or who depend on collective immunity to survive. The situation becomes a collision between two fundamental rights: the parent's liberty to practice their faith freely without government interference, and the child's right to life and health, along with the broader public's right to safety from preventable disease. This dilemma persists in societies that simultaneously champion religious freedom as a cornerstone of individual liberty, while also recognizing the state's duty to protect vulnerable populations from harm, creating a genuine tension that has no easy resolution because both principles carry profound moral weight. The psychological mechanism that perpetuates this conflict operates through a kind of moral compartmentalization, where individuals can hold their sincere religious convictions as absolute truths while remaining somewhat insulated from the concrete consequences their choices impose on others, particularly those without voice or agency in the decision. We have normalized this persistence by creating legal frameworks that grant parents extraordinary authority over children's medical decisions based on religious grounds, frameworks that implicitly assume parental rights supersede child welfare in these specific cases, even though we would never accept such reasoning in other contexts where a parent's beliefs might endanger offspring. The system persists because religious freedom is protected with an intensity that other rights rarely receive, because questioning it feels like questioning someone's identity and deepest meaning-making systems, and because the harms, while real and sometimes tragic, are often distributed across many individuals rather than concentrated in ways that force immediate confrontation with the consequences of our protections. Consider a neighborhood that has existed for generations, its character built by families who invested their lives, their labor, and their modest savings into building something meaningful within its boundaries, creating cultural institutions, small businesses, and social networks that have become the fabric of their collective identity. Then imagine that urban planners, developers, and investors discover this neighborhood, recognizing its potential for profit, its location near transportation hubs, or its proximity to revitalized districts, and they begin purchasing properties, renovating storefronts, attracting new restaurants and boutiques that cater to higher-income newcomers willing to pay premium prices for the authenticity and grit that the original residents created. Property values rise dramatically, tax assessments increase, and longtime residents who own their homes suddenly face unbearable financial burdens, while those who rent find their landlords selling to developers or raising rents beyond their means, forcing them to leave the only place they have ever known. The mechanism behind this process is straightforward on the surface. Capital seeks returns, markets respond to demand, and property ownership operates under principles of profit maximization. Yet what makes gentrification particularly morally complex is that it creates a paradoxical situation where the very qualities that make a neighborhood desirable to outside investment are the qualities that existing residents created through decades of cultural contribution, community building, and authentic presence. And yet those residents receive no compensation for creating the value that enriches others. We have normalized this process as simply how cities evolve and markets function, accepting displacement as an inevitable consequence of progress and development, rarely questioning why communities should bear the cost of their own erasure, or why the wealth they generated through their presence and creativity should flow exclusively to distant investors rather than benefiting those who made the neighborhood worth investing in at all. Imagine a society where millions of young adults carry the weight of educational loans into their 30s and 40s, paying thousands of dollars each month toward interest that often exceeds the principal they borrowed, delaying home ownership, marriage, childbearing, and basic financial security in ways previous generations never experienced. And now consider the moral question of whether these debts should be forgiven through government action, redistributing the burden from individuals to taxpayers, some of whom never attended college or already paid their own way through school or trade work. The dilemma emerges because education is simultaneously framed as both a personal investment in individual future earnings and a public good essential to societal progress, creating a fundamental tension about who should bear the cost. On one side stands the argument that student debt forgiveness would liberate millions from financial servitude, stimulate economic activity as freed-up income circulates through communities, and acknowledge that education systems have become predatory in their pricing structures, with institutions raising costs precisely because loans became available, creating a cycle where government-backed lending directly inflated tuition to unsustainable levels. Yet on the other side sits the counterargument that forgiving debt is fundamentally unjust to those who sacrifice to pay their obligations, that it rewards poor financial decision-making and punishes responsible choices, that it represents a regressive transfer from working-class taxpayers to college-educated professionals who will statistically earn more over their lifetimes, and that it does nothing to address the underlying problem of why education costs so much in the first place. Consider the pharmaceutical company that invests billions of dollars into research and development, spending years conducting clinical trials and navigating regulatory approval processes, only to create a medication that saves thousands of lives from a previously untreatable disease. Once approved, this company secures a patent that grants them exclusive rights to manufacture and sell this drug for 20 years, allowing them to set the price at whatever level the market will bear, sometimes charging hundreds or thousands of dollars per dose to patients who would otherwise face death or permanent disability. A mother in one country can access this life-saving treatment because her insurance covers it, while an equally sick child in another country dies because their family cannot afford the astronomical cost that the patent protection maintains. The moral tension emerges from a peculiar collision between two seemingly virtuous systems: the capitalist incentive structure that motivates innovation through the promise of profit, and the basic human imperative that medicine should be accessible to those who need it most, regardless of their economic status. The psychological mechanism at work here is our comfort with abstraction and distance. We understand intellectually that patents drive innovation and that companies need revenue to survive, yet we simultaneously understand that denying medicine to someone because they cannot pay is a form of harm. We have constructed an elaborate intellectual framework that allows us to hold both truths without confronting their fundamental contradiction, telling ourselves that this is simply how systems must work, that there is no alternative, that the alternative would be worse. We normalize this dilemma by treating it as inevitable rather than as a choice we collectively make every single day, a choice to permit some people to die from treatable conditions so that others may have access to medical advancement, a choice wrapped in the language of market economics and presented as natural law rather than human decision. Consider the fundamental paradox that exists within capital punishment systems across the world, where societies maintain the legal authority to execute individuals despite the irrefutable historical record, demonstrating that innocent people have been condemned to death, and in many documented cases, have actually been executed for crimes they did not commit. This dilemma forces us to confront a question that appears almost logically impossible to answer fairly. If our judicial system is demonstrably fallible, capable of producing wrongful convictions through eyewitness misidentification, false confessions, inadequate legal representation, prosecutorial misconduct, or exculpatory evidence that emerges too late, then how can we justify implementing a punishment that cannot be undone, cannot be corrected, and cannot provide restitution once the condemned person has been executed? The psychological mechanism that allows this system to persist operates through what might be called statistical rationalization, where societies acknowledge the possibility of executing an innocent person as an acceptable cost of maintaining justice for the guilty, essentially making the implicit calculation that some number of innocent deaths is a reasonable price for deterrence or retribution. We compartmentalize this knowledge, separating the abstract statistics from the concrete reality of actual human beings who have spent years on death row only to be exonerated by DNA evidence or newly discovered witnesses. Yet we continue operating systems that carry this identical risk forward. What makes this particularly revealing about human moral inconsistency is that we would consider unacceptable in almost every other domain of government the kind of permanent, irreversible harm that we accept as standard procedure in capital punishment, and yet the system persists, suggesting that we have somehow normalized the idea that executing innocent people represents a necessary evil rather than an inherent flaw that should fundamentally disqualify a practice from being used at all. Consider the situation where a married person develops an increasingly intimate emotional connection with someone outside their relationship, sharing vulnerabilities, secrets, and daily thoughts that they no longer share with their spouse, creating a parallel emotional intimacy that exists in the space between friendship and romance, neither fully crossing physical lines nor remaining innocent, and when confronted about this dynamic, the person insists they have done nothing wrong because no physical infidelity has occurred, yet their partner feels profoundly betrayed by the emotional displacement and the sense of being replaced in the role of primary confidant and emotional support. The psychological mechanism at work here involves the way humans compartmentalize intimacy, treating emotional and physical fidelity as separate categories rather than recognizing them as interconnected expressions of commitment and exclusivity within a relationship. And the person engaging in the emotional affair often uses this distinction as a defense mechanism, unconsciously convincing themselves that the relationship remains intact because they have not crossed a socially recognized threshold of betrayal, even though they have fundamentally shifted their emotional availability away from their spouse toward someone else. What persists despite its logical incoherence is the cultural narrative that emotional intimacy without physical contact constitutes a gray area, a space where boundaries become blurry and subjective, when in reality an emotional affair represents the same breach of trust and exclusivity as a physical one, merely expressed through different channels. And we have normalized this distinction in our relationships by accepting it as a legitimate debate rather than recognizing it as a form of infidelity that damages the foundational trust between partners, allowing people to engage in deep emotional betrayals while maintaining a sense of moral innocence based solely on where the connection stops rather than what the connection has replaced. Consider the texture of your morning commute, where a colleague asks how you are and you respond, "I'm doing great," despite having slept poorly and feeling the weight of anxiety pressing against your chest. And in that moment, you have chosen a small untruth not out of malice, but out of something more subtle, a social lubricant that prevents the machinery of daily interaction from grinding to a halt. These white lies form the invisible scaffolding of civilization, the minor falsehoods we tell ourselves and others to navigate the complex terrain of human relationships without constant emotional friction. When your friend asks if you like their new haircut and you smile and nod despite thinking it unflattering, or when you tell your mother that dinner was delicious when it was actually quite mediocre, you are engaged in a calculation that prioritizes social harmony over absolute truth, a calculation so automatic that we rarely pause to examine its moral weight. The psychological mechanism underlying white lies is rooted in our deep need for connection balanced against our simultaneous need to protect ourselves and others from unnecessary pain, and we convince ourselves that these small deceptions are acts of kindness rather than breaches of integrity, that the preservation of someone's feelings justifies the violation of their right to honest information. What makes white lies particularly fascinating is how thoroughly normalized they have become despite the fundamental contradiction they represent. We teach children that honesty is paramount while simultaneously modeling the strategic deployment of falsehoods, We construct entire professional cultures around the polite fiction that everyone is performing at their best despite obvious evidence to the contrary, and we accept that the texture of modern life requires this constant low-level dishonesty. Imagine you discover a wallet containing $500 in cash, along with identification on a park bench where you were sitting alone, with no witnesses around you and no cameras visible in the immediate area. Your first instinct might be to return it to its owner, perhaps by calling the number on a license or turning it in to the park office. Yet in that moment of solitude, another thought emerges. Nobody would know if you simply kept the money, and the original owner might assume they lost it carelessly or that someone else had already taken it. The question that surfaces is whether the money becomes yours through the accident of discovery, whether finders keepers represents a legitimate moral principle, or whether possession without intent to steal still constitutes a form of theft. What makes this dilemma psychologically compelling is that it involves no direct harm to anyone in the moment of decision. The owner has already lost the money, and taking it does not create a new loss, but rather determines who absorbs an existing one. Our minds rationalize this by considering probability and consequence. The owner may never know who kept it, their insurance might cover the loss, they might be wealthy enough to absorb the cost, or they may have deserved to lose it through their own negligence. Yet beneath this reasoning lies a fundamental question about whether morality requires a witness or whether ethical behavior exists independently of observation and consequence. We have constructed elaborate systems to incentivize returning found money through feelings of guilt, through legal consequences, and through appeals to empathy for the person who lost it, suggesting that without these external pressures, many of us might keep what we find. The persistence of this dilemma reveals that we have not truly internalized the principle that belongings are morally bound to their owners regardless of how they come to be separated, and that our ethics remain deeply dependent on social surveillance rather than internal conviction. Consider a parent standing in a kitchen, frustrated after repeated warnings have gone unheeded, reaching out to strike their child on the buttocks or hand as a means of behavioral correction, a practice that has persisted across cultures and generations as a default tool for instilling discipline and respect. This act represents a fundamental paradox in child-rearing philosophy, where an adult deliberately inflicts physical discomfort upon a smaller, more vulnerable human being with the stated intention of teaching them appropriate behavior. And yet the mechanism by which pain produces learning remains conceptually murky and emotionally complicated. The psychological theory underlying spanking suggests that negative reinforcement through physical punishment creates an immediate association between undesired behavior and discomfort, theoretically deterring the child from repeating the action in the future, though neuroscience increasingly questions whether this mechanism actually produces lasting behavioral change or merely teaches children that physical force is an acceptable problem-solving tool when one person has power over another. What makes this dilemma particularly fascinating is how thoroughly we have normalized the contradiction between teaching children that hitting others is wrong while simultaneously hitting them as punishment, creating a learned exception to our own stated moral rules, a cognitive dissonance that somehow coexists within millions of households without generating the profound unease that logic would seem to demand. The persistence of spanking despite decades of research suggesting superior alternatives reveals how deeply embedded this practice has become in our cultural inheritance, how it survived not through evidence but through intergenerational transmission, where parents spank because they were spanked, justifying the continuation through a form of reversed logic that interprets their survival as proof of efficacy. Imagine you are a parent whose child has been diagnosed with a serious chronic illness, and a teacher at school requests access to your medical records to better understand your child's condition and limitations during the school day. The teacher seems genuinely motivated to help, expressing sincere concern and a desire to accommodate your child's needs in the classroom environment. You feel the weight of gratitude for this apparent care, yet you also recognize that medical records contain deeply intimate information about your body, your vulnerabilities, your past treatments, your mental health diagnoses, and details about your family's genetic predispositions that extend far beyond what is necessary for anyone outside your immediate circle to know. The ethical tension emerges because sharing creates genuine benefit, yet withholding protects fundamental privacy, and you cannot easily do both. The psychological mechanism underlying this dilemma involves the conflict between beneficence, our drive to help others and accept help when offered, and autonomy, our fundamental right to control who accesses the most sensitive information about ourselves. We are taught to trust authority figures like educators and healthcare providers, to believe their intentions are pure, and to assume that sharing information facilitates better care and understanding. Yet history repeatedly demonstrates that medical information has been weaponized against marginalized groups, used to discriminate in employment and insurance, and violated by institutions claiming noble purposes. This dilemma persists precisely because we have normalized the idea that good intentions justify access to private information, that transparency within systems of care should be unconditional, and that refusing to share somehow makes us difficult, uncooperative, or indifferent to our own well-being. We have accepted a framework where privacy feels like a luxury rather than a right, where the burden of proof falls on us to demonstrate why information should remain confidential rather than on others to justify why they need access to it. Consider the relationship between a 55-year-old and a 28-year-old, two consenting adults who meet and fall in love, yet find themselves navigating a world that views their partnership with deep suspicion and moral uncertainty. The age gap relationship exists in a peculiar space where legality and ethics diverge sharply, where biology and psychology intersect in ways that challenge our fundamental assumptions about love, power, and fairness. One partner has accumulated decades of life experience, financial stability, and social authority, while the other is still navigating early adulthood, building their career, and developing their sense of identity. The question that emerges from this scenario is not whether it can happen, but whether it should, and more troublingly, whether one person's advantage automatically corrupts the consent of the other. The psychological mechanism underlying our discomfort involves power imbalance, a genuine concern rooted in observable human dynamics, where experience and resources create invisible hierarchies that can be exploited, even unintentionally. We recognize that the older partner has likely completed their identity formation, while the younger is still in progress, and this asymmetry feels intrinsically unfair. Yet society simultaneously normalizes age gaps when the younger partner is older, treating a 40-year-old and a 60-year-old pairing as entirely unremarkable, while scrutinizing a 30-year-old and 50-year-old with intense judgment. We have created arbitrary thresholds and exceptions, determining that certain gaps are acceptable only after specific ages are reached, suggesting that our moral concern is less about the mathematical difference and more about our anxieties regarding exploitation at particular life stages. The persistence of age gap relationships despite social disapproval reveals that human connection operates on principles that resist our neat categorical frameworks, and our inability to establish consistent ethical standards around this issue perhaps indicates that the taboo serves more psychological and social functions than it solves actual harms. Consider the situation where a person who has struggled with severe gambling addiction for years finally achieves a period of sustained recovery, maintaining abstinence and rebuilding their financial and relational stability, only to face a critical moral question. Should they be permitted complete freedom to gamble again in moderation, or should they accept permanent restrictions on their own autonomy as a protective measure against relapse? The dilemma emerges because we fundamentally believe in personal liberty and the right to make our own choices, even choices that carry risk. Yet we simultaneously recognize that addiction fundamentally alters the brain's reward system in ways that make moderate engagement neurologically implausible for many people. The recovering person argues that permanent prohibition feels like a loss of selfhood and autonomy, a punishment that extends indefinitely even after demonstrating years of strength and commitment to recovery, while others contend that gambling, unlike some other addictive substances, remains legally and socially available everywhere, making true abstinence extraordinarily difficult to maintain when the opportunity is constantly present. The psychological mechanism at work here involves our deep ambivalence about whether addiction constitutes a moral failing, a disease, or a combination of both. Because if it is purely a disease, then restricting someone's freedom seems medically appropriate. But if it involves elements of choice and character, then denying someone the opportunity to exercise restraint feels paternalistic and infantilizing. We have normalized this ambivalence by creating structures like Gamblers Anonymous that emphasize permanent abstinence, while simultaneously maintaining a culture where casinos, sports betting, and lottery systems are woven into the social fabric. subtly suggesting that gambling itself is acceptable and normal while only certain people lack the self-control to engage responsibly. A contradiction that allows us to avoid acknowledging that perhaps the systems themselves are the problem rather than the individual's weakness. Consider the moment when a server brings your meal to your table, provides attentive service throughout your dining experience, and presents you with the bill. At that moment, you face an unspoken expectation embedded so deeply in social convention that questioning it feels almost transgressive, yet the moral mechanics underlying this expectation deserve careful examination. Tipping culture, particularly in the United States, has created a peculiar economic arrangement wherein customers are socially obligated to supplement the wages of service workers, wages that employers have deliberately kept minimal under the assumption that tips will bridge the gap to a livable income. This system places the financial burden of worker compensation onto patrons rather than onto the businesses that directly employ and profit from those workers' labor. Psychological mechanism that sustains this practice operates through multiple overlapping forces. We experience social pressure and judgment from both servers and other diners who witness our tipping behavior. We feel guilt knowing that underpayment reflects on the worker rather than the employer. We internalize the narrative that tipping is a reward for exceptional service rather than acknowledging it as wage supplementation. And we experience shame at the prospect of being perceived as stingy or cruel. Yet when examined logically, the system lacks internal coherence. Why should customers subsidize labor costs that businesses should absorb? Why do we calculate tips as percentages of the total bill, meaning a server who brings you an expensive bottle of wine deserves more compensation than one who brings you water, despite equivalent effort? Why have we normalized a practice where servers depend on the discretionary goodwill of strangers rather than guaranteed compensation from their employers? Imagine walking into a clothing store and purchasing a shirt for $10, a pair of jeans for $15, a dress for $20, knowing full well that these garments were assembled by human hands working in conditions you would never accept for yourself or anyone you love. The shirt you buy on impulse, wear perhaps 5 times, and discard was likely produced in a factory in South Asia or Southeast Asia where workers, many of them women and children, labor for 12 to 16 hours per day in poorly ventilated spaces filled with textile dust and chemical fumes, earning wages so minimal they cannot afford adequate food, housing, or health care. The psychological mechanism that allows this system to persist is the profound distance between consumer and consequence, a separation that operates not merely in geography but in narrative architecture. We have constructed stories that insulate us from responsibility. We tell ourselves that these jobs, however exploitative by our standards, represent economic opportunity for desperately poor communities, that raising wages would eliminate employment entirely, that our individual purchasing decisions cannot possibly matter against such massive global systems. We have learned to metabolize cognitive dissonance, to simultaneously hold the knowledge that fast fashion depends on human suffering while experiencing the emotional reward of acquiring new clothing at prices that feel democratizing rather than predatory. The remarkable persistence of this system, despite its logical indefensibility, reveals how thoroughly normalized exploitation becomes when it is distributed across continents and mediated through corporate supply chains so complex that accountability dissolves into abstraction. Consider the scenario where advances in genetic screening allow parents to detect potential abnormalities or genetic conditions in a developing fetus with remarkable accuracy, enabling them to make informed decisions about whether to continue a pregnancy. And imagine yourself facing this choice with full knowledge of what the test results might reveal about your future child's health, cognitive abilities, or quality of life. The situation presents a profound intersection of medical capability, parental autonomy, and fundamental questions about what constitutes a life worth living, forcing individuals to weigh the desire to prevent suffering against the possibility that they might be eliminating a potential person based on incomplete information or societal prejudices about disability. The psychological mechanism operating here involves what might be called conditional acceptance, wherein prospective parents unconsciously operate under the framework that their love and commitment to raising a child depends upon that child meeting certain baseline criteria of health or normalcy, a framework that feels protective and rational in the moment, but subtly codifies the idea that some lives are more deserving of existence than others based on predetermined characteristics. This decision-making process becomes further complicated by the influence of medical professionals who present testing as a routine part of prenatal care, by insurance systems that may incentivize certain choices, and by societal narratives that frame disability as tragedy rather than difference, all of which combine to create an environment where the choice to terminate a pregnancy based on genetic findings can feel like the responsible, compassionate decision, even as it raises troubling questions about selection, worth, and acceptance. Consider the parent who chooses to homeschool their child for academic reasons, believing they can provide superior education within the home environment, yet simultaneously harbors a genuine anxiety about whether this decision will irreparably damage their child's ability to form friendships, navigate social hierarchies, and develop the interpersonal skills that society deems essential for human flourishing. This parent may spend considerable time and resources arranging extracurricular activities, sports leagues, and homeschool co-ops in an attempt to compensate for the absence of traditional classroom social exposure, creating an exhausting supplementary system that consumes energy that might otherwise have been devoted to actual academics. The underlying psychological mechanism at work involves a fundamental tension between two competing values that our culture has simultaneously elevated to paramount importance: the right and ability of parents to customize their children's education according to their beliefs and capabilities, and the assumption that socialization, as it occurs in traditional schools, represents an irreplaceable and essential component of healthy child development. We have normalized the idea that children need peer interaction in large groups within institutional settings to develop properly, even though this assumption is relatively recent in human history and varies dramatically across cultures and time periods. Yet simultaneously, we acknowledge that traditional schools often fail to provide genuinely meaningful social development, instead fostering anxiety, bullying, conformity, and social dysfunction in many students. The paradox deepens because parents who homeschool often report that their children develop stronger social skills than their peers, possess more confidence in mixed-age interactions, and demonstrate greater independence in relationship building. Yet this evidence rarely alleviates the cultural anxiety surrounding homeschooled children's social trajectories. Consider the paradox of modern medical ethics. We celebrate individual autonomy as a fundamental human right, yet we routinely override it in specific circumstances that feel justified in the moment. Imagine a scenario where a competent adult refuses a life-saving blood transfusion due to sincere religious beliefs, and a court orders the transfusion anyway, prioritizing survival over consent. Or consider the case of a pregnant woman whose doctor recommends a cesarean section against her wishes, and the state threatens intervention to protect the fetus, effectively asserting that her bodily integrity becomes conditional once she carries another life. These situations reveal a troubling inconsistency. We declare that no one can be forced to donate organs, blood, or bone marrow to save another person's life, yet we sometimes compel pregnant women to undergo medical procedures against their will, or we override the wishes of dying patients when family members contest their advance directives. The psychological mechanism underlying this contradiction appears rooted in how we weigh competing moral values when they collide. Society operates from an assumption that some circumstances demand us to suspend the principle of bodily autonomy in favor of other goods like survival, protection of potential life, or prevention of harm. Yet this calculus remains remarkably inconsistent across different scenarios. A parent might be legally permitted to refuse chemotherapy for themselves, but prosecuted for refusing it for their child, suggesting that autonomy itself has variable moral weight depending on context. What persists despite its logical fragility is our comfort with this selective application of rights. We have normalized the idea that bodily autonomy is not truly inviolable, but rather contextual, negotiable, and subject to override by state interests in ways we rarely articulate clearly. This ambiguity allows us to maintain the fiction of absolute autonomy while routinely violating it. Imagine receiving an offer from a major technology company. They will provide you with exceptional services, financial rewards, or even life-saving medical insights, but only if you consent to the continuous collection and analysis of your most intimate digital behaviors, your location data, your search histories, your messages, and even your biometric information. The company promises to use this data responsibly, to encrypt it properly, and to never sell it to the highest bidder, yet you know from experience that such promises have been broken countless times before, and you understand that any breach, any hack, Any change in corporate ownership could expose everything you have ever done online. The dilemma sits at the intersection of genuine need and genuine risk. You might want the financial incentive because your family needs resources, or you might want the medical benefits because a diagnostic algorithm could detect illness years before traditional medicine. Yet accepting means surrendering the one remaining sphere of human existence where thoughts can still be private, where curiosity can still be exploratory without judgment, where shame and fear need not govern your behavior. What makes this dilemma persist is the fundamental asymmetry in how we have structured digital life. The companies offering these trades operate with perfect information about us while remaining opaque to us, creating a negotiating position so fundamentally imbalanced that meaningful consent becomes philosophically questionable. We have normalized this arrangement precisely because the alternative seems impossible. Opting out of digital participation now means economic exclusion, social isolation, and medical disadvantage. So we convince ourselves that privacy was never truly real anyway, that we have nothing to hide, that surveillance is simply the price of convenience. Yet the deeper tension remains unresolved in our collective conscience. Whether a society that trades privacy for comfort has genuinely chosen freedom or has simply made servitude so comfortable that we no longer recognize the chains. Consider the situation where a social media influencer with millions of followers, someone whose entire career has been built upon their perceived trustworthiness and relatability, begins to promote products or lifestyle habits that are scientifically proven to be harmful to human health. Whether that involves extreme dietary supplements with dangerous side effects, unregulated weight loss medications, crash diet programs that damage metabolism, or fitness routines that lead to overuse injuries and burnout. The influencer may genuinely believe in these products, or they may be aware of the deception, but prioritize the substantial financial compensation they receive from sponsorships and affiliate marketing commissions, which can amount to hundreds of thousands of dollars per single promotional post. Their audience, composed largely of young people who have grown up in digital environments where the line between advertising and authentic recommendation has become profoundly blurred, cannot easily distinguish between genuine endorsement and paid promotion, and they internalize these messages as trusted advice from someone they feel they know personally. The mechanism at work here involves the parasocial relationship, a psychological phenomenon where audiences develop a sense of genuine friendship and intimacy with public figures despite the relationship being entirely one-directional and transactional, combined with the influencer's cultivated aesthetic of authenticity that makes their recommendations feel more credible than traditional advertising. What makes this particularly challenging to address is that we have largely normalized this behavior within contemporary culture, constructing elaborate legal disclaimers and hashtag disclosures that technically satisfy regulatory requirements while remaining functionally invisible to most viewers. And we accept that people will naturally prioritize personal financial gain over the health and well-being of vulnerable populations who trust them. Treating this as simply how the attention economy functions rather than as a profound breach of ethical responsibility. Consider the employee who arrives at work on time, completes their assigned tasks with competence, and leaves precisely at 5 o'clock without lingering to answer emails or solve problems that technically fall outside their job description. They do not volunteer for extra projects, they do not respond to Slack messages after hours, and they do not sacrifice their evening or weekend time to demonstrate loyalty to an organization that views them fundamentally as a replaceable resource. This phenomenon, termed quiet quitting, represents a deliberate recalibration of the psychological contract between worker and employer, yet it has become morally fraught in ways that reveal something troubling about how we collectively think about labor and obligation. The mechanism at work here is fundamentally about power and perception, for when an employee was historically expected to demonstrate commitment through visible sacrifice and constant availability, the act of merely performing one's job became reframed as rebellion rather than reasonableness. Employers have spent decades cultivating cultures where exceeding baseline expectations became the baseline itself, where being present physically and mentally present beyond contracted hours became the unspoken price of job security and advancement, and where personal boundaries became interpreted as lack of ambition or team spirit. Yet the quiet quitter simply refuses this implicit bargain, choosing instead to honor the actual terms of employment while protecting their time, energy, and mental health from endless consumption. What makes this dilemma morally complex is not the quitter's behavior itself, which is entirely rational and self-protective, but rather how thoroughly we have normalized the opposite expectation, how we have constructed narratives where workaholism signals dedication rather than dysfunction, and how we have allowed the boundary between professional responsibility and personal exploitation to become so thoroughly blurred that stepping back appears as an ethical transgression rather than an act of reasonable self-preservation. Consider the modern person who gazes into a mirror and sees not their face, but a catalog of imperfections that demand correction. A woman in her 30s feels the weight of expectations to maintain the appearance of youth, despite having accomplished meaningful work and built genuine relationships. A man contemplates chin augmentation because social media has convinced him that his natural features fall short of an arbitrary standard established by filtered images and celebrity endorsements. The decision to undergo elective cosmetic surgery has become normalized to such a degree that choosing not to modify one's body can feel like a personal failure, a surrender to aging and irrelevance. This phenomenon operates through a complex mechanism of comparison and internalized judgment, where individuals measure themselves against impossible standards propagated through advertising, entertainment, and peer networks, each exposure reinforcing the belief that their natural bodies are somehow deficient and in need of professional alteration. The psychological mechanism feeds on a fundamental human vulnerability, the desire to be accepted and valued, and redirects it toward the pursuit of surgical enhancement as the solution to social belonging. What makes this particularly striking is how little rational foundation it requires. The body that functions perfectly well, that moves through the world without pain or limitation, becomes the subject of medical intervention not because it is broken, but because it fails to match a narrow aesthetic ideal that shifts constantly with trends and profit incentives. We have normalized the idea that preventative cosmetic surgery is self-care, that rejecting facial aging is rejecting decline itself, and that maintaining a youthful appearance through medical procedures is not a symptom of cultural anxiety, but rather a reasonable personal choice deserving no examination. Consider the student who finds themselves drowning in coursework, facing deadlines that seem designed to crush rather than educate, pressured by parents who equate grades with worth, and uncertain whether they truly understand the material or simply need a passing mark to survive another semester. In this moment of desperation, they encounter an opportunity, a service that promises to write their essay, their research paper, their thesis, in exchange for money they can barely afford. The ghostwriter on the other side of this transaction is often a skilled writer themselves, perhaps a graduate student or a published author struggling to pay rent, who sees this work as pragmatic rather than dishonest, a way to leverage their abilities into immediate income. The student submits the work with their own name attached, the professor grades it, and the institutional machinery continues operating as though legitimate learning has occurred, when in fact something has been fundamentally circumvented. The mechanism at work here is deceptively logical. Both parties benefit materially in the present moment. The student gets the grade they need for their record, the writer gets the payment they need for their survival, and the system continues to function on paper as it always has. What makes this dilemma particularly challenging is that it exists within a landscape of legitimate academic struggles that have intensified across decades. Where education has become increasingly expensive, competition has become increasingly fierce, and the gap between those who can afford supplementary help and those who cannot has widened substantially. We have somehow normalized the idea that the credential matters more than the learning, that the institutional record is what counts rather than the actual knowledge a person possesses, and yet we simultaneously maintain the fiction that academic work represents authentic individual achievement. Consider the moment when you receive a gift that does not resonate with you, something chosen with good intentions but fundamentally misaligned with your tastes, needs, or values, and you find yourself faced with a choice that society has paradoxically made both necessary and taboo simultaneously. The practice of regifting, that is, giving to someone else a present you yourself received, exists in this strange liminal space where nearly everyone acknowledges doing it, yet nearly everyone also treats it as a minor moral transgression that should be hidden and never discussed openly. You might receive a decorative item, a book you will never read, a gadget incompatible with your lifestyle, or clothing in a size or style that will never suit you, and rather than let it languish unused in a closet, you consider passing it along to someone for whom it might hold genuine value. The psychological mechanism underlying this dilemma involves competing loyalties and social anxieties that have become deeply embedded in how we approach gift exchange itself. On one hand, there exists the practical logic of resource efficiency and the genuine desire to ensure a gift serves someone well, which is fundamentally aligned with the original giver's unstated goal of bringing joy through giving. Yet on the other hand, there persists an unstated social agreement that regifting constitutes a subtle betrayal, a rejection of the original gift that feels like a rejection of the giver's judgment and effort, even though the giver need never know and the gift itself simply fulfills its intended purpose through different hands. Imagine you are a physician working in an emergency department during a mass casualty event, and before you stands the weight of impossible choices that will determine who lives and who dies based on nothing more than your clinical judgment and the resources available in that single moment. 3 patients arrive simultaneously. One is a 78-year-old man with severe internal bleeding and a very low probability of survival even with immediate intervention. Another is a 40-year-old woman with a serious but treatable injury who will almost certainly die without surgery in the next 2 hours. And the third is a 23-year-old with moderate injuries who could survive with basic stabilization and time. You have one operating room available, one surgical team, and perhaps enough resources to save 2 of these 3 people adequately. But the calculus demands that you choose who receives what level of care in what order. This is triage, and it forces you to abandon the fundamental medical principle of equal care and instead embrace utilitarian mathematics that reduces human beings to statistical probabilities and years of potential life remaining. The psychological mechanism underlying triage is a peculiar form of moral mathematics that our minds perform almost automatically when faced with true scarcity. We begin to weigh factors like age, likelihood of survival, years of life expectancy, and social utility, making rapid assessments that in normal circumstances would feel unconscionable and discriminatory. Our brains essentially perform a cost-benefit analysis at the speed of trauma, calculating whose life is most salvageable with limited resources, which means we are forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that medicine is not purely about saving lives, but about optimizing outcomes within constraints. Consider the person who has repeatedly betrayed your trust, who has made promises and broken them multiple times, who has demonstrated through consistent action that their words mean very little, and yet you find yourself standing at a crossroads asking whether you should offer them one more opportunity to prove themselves. This is the dilemma of second chances and their limits, a moral territory where compassion and self-protection collide in ways that feel deeply uncomfortable. We tell ourselves that people can change, that redemption is always possible, that to deny someone another chance is to close the door on their potential growth and transformation. Yet simultaneously, we recognize something equally true, that repeatedly offering chances to someone who shows no genuine commitment to change becomes less about grace and more about enabling, a slow erosion of our own boundaries that masquerades as virtue. The psychological mechanism underlying this dilemma rests on what researchers call the just world hypothesis combined with fundamental attribution error. We want to believe that effort leads to change, that sincerity creates transformation, that if we simply love someone enough or give them enough opportunities, the pattern will break. But human behavior is far more complex than this hopeful narrative, shaped by deeply ingrained patterns, personality structures, and often a profound lack of genuine motivation to alter course. The person seeking another chance may genuinely believe they will change this time, yet find themselves repeating the same destructive patterns within weeks or months. We normalize this contradiction by creating a mythology around second chances, treating them as universally virtuous without asking the harder question. At what point does offering more chances become a form of self-harm disguised as compassion? Consider the parent standing in a toy store with their child, who has begun to whimper and point at an expensive object they do not need. And in this moment, the parent faces a genuine moral question that extends far deeper than a simple purchase decision. The question becomes whether providing this child with material comfort and the immediate cessation of their distress represents an act of love and provision, or whether withholding the purchase and allowing the child to experience disappointment and frustration constitutes the more ethical choice that builds character and teaches delayed gratification. The parent worries that saying no might damage their relationship with the child, might make them feel unloved or deprived compared to their peers, and yet simultaneously understands that excessive indulgence can create an adult incapable of managing desire or understanding the concept of genuine earning. This dilemma persists because both positions contain legitimate psychological truth. Research demonstrates that children who receive consistent boundaries develop stronger emotional regulation and self-worth, yet children who feel genuinely cared for and occasionally celebrated also develop secure attachment and confidence. The tension arises because love and discipline are not actually opposing forces, and yet modern parenting culture has increasingly positioned them as such, creating a false binary where choosing discipline somehow means choosing cruelty, and choosing indulgence somehow means choosing genuine care. We have normalized the belief that the more we give our children materially, the more we are protecting them from psychological harm, when in fact the opposite may be true, and yet we persist in this pattern because the immediate reward of our child's smile and gratitude feels like evidence that we have chosen correctly, while the long-term benefits of appropriate limits remain invisible until years later when they manifest as either competence or entitlement. Consider the modern parent who finds themselves caught in an escalating cycle of achievement benchmarking, where their child's academic performance, extracurricular accomplishments, and social standing become metrics by which the parent's own success is measured and judged by their community. This parent watches other families attend tutoring centers, enrolls their own child to keep pace, then observes wealthier families hire private coaches, and feels compelled to do the same despite financial strain, creating a behavioral cascade where each decision to invest more resources in their child's development stems not from genuine educational conviction, but from the fear of relative deprivation and social stigma. The psychological mechanism underlying this phenomenon operates through several interconnected layers. First, the human brain is exquisitely sensitive to comparative status rather than absolute outcomes, meaning that a child's B+ grade feels like failure when peers are achieving A pluses, regardless of the child's own progress or potential. Second, parental identity has become deeply fused with child outcomes in contemporary culture, such that a parent's worth as a human being is increasingly conflated with their child's achievements, creating intense personal anxiety whenever that child underperforms relative to others. And third, the visible performance of other families through social media and community observation creates an illusion of widespread hyperparenting that may not reflect reality, but nonetheless generates genuine motivational pressure. Imagine standing in a grocery store on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, and you reach for a bottle of water wrapped in plastic that will be discarded within minutes, knowing full well that you have a reusable bottle at home that you simply forgot to bring with you. Yet the inconvenience of walking to your car or waiting until you return home feels so unbearable in that moment that you make the purchase anyway, contributing to the estimated 8 million tons of plastic entering our oceans annually without a second thought. This scenario repeats millions of times each day across the globe, where individuals consciously choose the path of least resistance despite possessing complete knowledge of the environmental consequences, and the mechanism behind this behavior is surprisingly straightforward. Our brains are wired to prioritize immediate discomfort over abstract future harm, meaning that the tangible inconvenience of carrying a reusable bottle or waiting to satisfy thirst registers as a more pressing concern than the intangible notion of harm occurring to ecosystems thousands of miles away or decades into the future. We have become expert rationalizers, convincing ourselves that our single purchase is negligible in the grand scheme of planetary destruction, that corporations bear the true responsibility for environmental degradation, or that recycling the bottle will somehow absolve us of guilt. Yet these are simply mechanisms we have constructed to sidestep the cognitive dissonance that arises when our actions contradict our stated values. What is most striking is how normalized and accepted this contradiction has become in modern society, how we have collectively agreed to maintain this delusion that convenience and environmental responsibility exist on separate planes, how we celebrate minor gestures of sustainability while maintaining lifestyles fundamentally incompatible with planetary health, and how we rarely acknowledge that this pattern represents perhaps the most profound moral failure of our era. one in which we sacrifice the future habitability of Earth for the sake of avoiding minor inconveniences today. Consider the person who has spent decades cultivating a unique perspective, developing unconventional ideas, and nurturing talents that diverge sharply from societal expectations, only to face a critical juncture where expressing these genuine aspects of themselves would result in social ostracism, professional rejection, or familial disappointment. This individual must choose between remaining authentically themselves and adopting the comfortable mask of conformity that would grant them acceptance, security, and the basic human need to belong within their community. The dilemma runs deeper than simple peer pressure, for it involves the internalization of values that society has embedded so thoroughly within our psychological architecture that we often cannot distinguish between our own authentic desires and the desires we believe we should have. The mechanism operates through a fundamental survival instinct rooted in our evolutionary past, when belonging to the group meant literal survival and expulsion meant death. Our brains are wired to detect social disapproval and respond to it as we would respond to physical danger, triggering anxiety, shame, and a powerful drive to conform, even when conforming contradicts our deepest sense of self. We have constructed elaborate systems of institutions, from schools to workplaces to religious organizations, that systematize and normalize this pressure to conform while simultaneously praising individuality as an abstract virtue. This paradox persists because conformity provides measurable social benefits and reduces friction in coordinated group functioning, while authentic individuality carries real costs that vary depending on the degree of divergence and the rigidity of the surrounding culture. We rarely acknowledge how thoroughly we have normalized the suppression of authentic self-expression in exchange for the basic necessities of survival and social inclusion, treating this compromise as though it were a reasonable trade rather than a profound sacrifice of human integrity that shapes entire lives and generations of inherited shame and unfulfilled potential.